The main character in this story had only one desire in life, to reach the very pinnacle of martial arts. But over time, he realized that even if he spent his entire life training, it would never be enough to fulfill his dream. He was simply not destined to reach the pinnacle of martial arts mastery. And yet, despite his deep despair, he refused to give up. He decided to set out in search of an ancient legend, an ancient tale of a divine dragon guarding a golden fruit, which, according to rumors, granted immortality to anyone who ate it. After a fierce and deadly battle with the divine guardian dragon, he finally reached the sacred place where, they said, this legendary fruit grew. He could hardly believe it. The legendary golden fruit turned out to be real. Its radiant golden light illuminated everything around it, exuding a mysterious, divine aura. Seeing it, he was greatly surprised and scratched his head. And then, exhausted from the long battle, he sat on the corpse of the defeated divine dragon, unable to take his eyes off the glowing fruit. Catching his breath, he slowly stood up and walked toward the tree. His chest swelled with confidence. He believed that with this fruit, he would finally be able to reach the pinnacle of martial arts, which he had dreamed of his entire life. Without hesitation, he plucked the golden fruit and began to eat it. The moment he swallowed it, a strange and powerful energy surged through his body. His veins throbbed, his blood boiled, and his entire being trembled, as if being reshaped by a divine force. It was then that it became clear that this man's name was Gilfas Eldragon, the very same man who had been proclaimed the strongest person in the entire world. But decades later, Gilfas Eldragon had grown old. The scene had changed. Now he lay helplessly in bed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. They whispered to one another that his time was near, and that they needed to come to terms with his imminent passing. His eldest son, Gilliam, held his father's hand tightly, his eyes weary and sad. Gilfas, still the head of the Eldragon family, told his son that he didn't want to see sadness on their faces, and that his time had simply come. Gilliam forced a smile and said in a trembling voice that the estate had already grown gloomy after their mother's death, and with their father's passing, it would become even lonelier. Then, as silence filled the room, Gilfas remembered the golden fruit. He admitted to himself that, in the end, perhaps no one could truly believe in the myths of the ancient world, and yet he felt lucky, for he had lived long enough to start a family of his own. He told his loved ones that he had lived a long and fulfilling life, and that he had no regrets, but deep down, he knew that was a lie. Even now, he still couldn't let go of his dream. If only he had more time, he would have continued striving for the pinnacle of martial arts, a dream that had eluded him his entire life. But he kept chasing it, and so, in his final moments, he clung to that desire until his very last breath. The eldest son shed a tear when his father breathed his last. However, by a completely unexpected turn of events, Gilfas opened his eyes again. Confused, he wondered if he had simply fallen asleep. Everything seemed somehow strange. His room was different. His body felt light. When he finally looked at his hands, his eyes widened in disbelief. He realized with horror that these were not his hands. They were a child's hands. And the thought flashed through his mind that he might have turned into a baby. He quickly realized he was in an extremely bizarre situation. But as a 10-star martial arts master, he couldn't fathom how anyone could have done this to him without him noticing. After thinking for just a moment, it dawned on him. He remembered that very day, that dragon, and that very tree. The divine dragon and the golden fruit. That was the cause of the events unfolding. He finally understood. The fruit's effect was not immortality, but reincarnation. Though this was unexpected, the realization filled him with joy. He had been given another chance, a second life, to reach the summit that had eluded him before. Soon, he noticed he wasn't alone in the room. Looking around, he realized he was in a wing of the Eldragon estate. Somehow, he had been reborn into the very same family. But the room was filled with other babies, and just as he was wondering why there were so many children here, a group of maids entered carrying baby bottles. But, strangely enough, instead of milk, they contained a red liquid. Gilfas watched as the maids poured the crimson substance into the bottles. He thought they were going to feed the babies, but suddenly one of the maids brought out a goblin. They forcefully poured the contents of the bottle into the goblin's mouth. The boy didn't understand why the goblin was there or what they were up to. A few moments later, the goblin began to shake violently. A red light burst from its body, and then it exploded in a bloody shower, splattering everything in the room. Gilfas froze in shock. Fear and confusion filled his mind. He wondered what on earth was going on here. One of the maids calmly stated that the mixture would be safe if they added the correct amount of water. As they began feeding the red liquid to the other babies, another maid picked up Gilfas himself. He looked at the bottle and immediately realized it wasn't milk. The energy emanating from it was frighteningly powerful. He sensed that this liquid was dragon's blood, and that it was far too dangerous for a newborn's fragile body. But before he could react, the maid shoved the bottle into his mouth. Instinctively, like any baby, he began to drink. At that very moment, a tremendous force surged through his veins. His tiny body trembled with pain. But Gilfas recognized it. The blood of the ancient dragons flowed within him. He looked around the room in bewilderment. How could these idiots have thought to feed them this? The protagonist had already swallowed a little of the liquid, but surely a small dose wouldn't kill him. He looked at the other babies. They were spitting out the red sludge too, and he should do the same. But then he realized something. He thought that while it was dangerous, it could also be a great opportunity. If he could absorb this power, he might surpass even his past self. Perhaps he would finally reach the true pinnacle of martial arts. With fierce determination, he continued to drink the dragon's blood. His will remained unshakable. Though he didn't know the goal, he decided to seize this opportunity. His veins bulged as the pure energy of this red liquid flowed through them. Finally, he grew tired and pulled away from the bottle. His mentor thought he could drink no more, but the protagonist mentally ordered them not to underestimate him. After all, he was Gilfas Eldragon himself. He repeated these words in his mind like a mantra, enduring the pain until he miraculously overcame it. The maid stared in disbelief as he kept drinking, surviving what should have been a death sentence. The boy, meanwhile, was struggling to absorb the dragon's power, for only in this way could he reach heights unattainable to him in his previous life. Inside his tiny body, two colossal dragon energies clashed fiercely, battling for dominance. Two enormous dragons. When one finally gained the upper hand over the other, Gilfas could hardly believe how easily he had absorbed this power. When the two dragon forces finally merged within him, he understood everything. It was the perfect opportunity. After drinking the last drop, he couldn't believe he had survived that crushing pain. Instead, his body had adapted. He noticed that a few other infants had also survived, which made him smile inwardly. He thought about how one should never underestimate a newborn's survival instincts. But, as was to be expected from a child's body, exhaustion soon overcame him. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite his triumph, Gilfas Eldragon, the reborn strongest man, slowly drifted off to sleep. 7 years later, he was already undergoing intense physical training. While doing one-armed push-ups, a massive boulder balanced on his feet. When he finally reached the 1000th rep, he kicked the boulder upward. And when it crashed to the ground with a thunderous roar, Gilfas could not believe the strength his body now possessed. The protagonist now lived under a new name, Sieg Eldragon. Sieg pondered how he had achieved such physical prowess at such a young age. Realizing that it was all thanks to the ancient dragon blood flowing through his veins, he remembered that every creature in this world possessed a so-called source of power. But the ancient dragon blood they were given as infants contained a colossal amount of this power. Those who survived after consuming it developed bodies that were far stronger than those of ordinary people. With the divine dragon source of power within him, Sieg knew he had already surpassed the limits he had reached at the same age in his past life. And since he was the only infant who had managed to absorb all the power of the ancient dragon's blood, his body had undergone a radical transformation. And yet, despite his progress, what frustrated him most was that he remained at only a 1-star level. He trained tirelessly, expecting to have reached at least 4 stars by now. A star was a measure of one's source of power. In this world, it was believed that the human body was like the universe. The more stars that shone within this inner universe, the stronger a person became. But generating new stars was becoming increasingly difficult. In his past life as Gilfas Eldragon, Sieg had achieved the unimaginable. 10 stars. He was the only person in the world to ever reach such a level. Sieg muttered about how quickly time flies. He was already 7 years old. It had come to light that he was the illegitimate child of the current head of the Eldragon family. His mother had died when he was still a baby, and to this day, he had never even seen his father's face, which he considered the height of irresponsibility. What shocked him most was the realization that 1,000 years had passed since his previous life, and after a millennium, the world had changed. An era of true survival of the fittest had dawned. The main proof of this was the practice of feeding infants the blood of ancient dragons, followed by a ritual known as the Dragon Trial. Only those who survived both drinking dragon blood and the Dragon Trial were considered worthy and had the right to receive an education and train as warriors of Eldragon. Naturally, Sieg was destined to become one of them, and yet every time he asked the maid assigned to care for him why no instructor had been sent for his training, she would only reply that she was not allowed to answer such questions. Even after he turned 7, Sieg hadn't received a single lesson. He wondered aloud if that wasn't strange. Sieg sighed and noted that, for now, strengthening his body was still more important than combat training. After all, if he wanted to, he could teach himself. Then Sieg asked for information about other surviving infants, or at least something about the main family that might help him. But the maid refused once again, stating that she was not allowed to disclose such information. Disappointment clouded Sieg's face. His tone grew noticeably sharper. He said he was simply asking about family matters. The maid was adamant and said with horror that she could not answer that question. Sieg asked bitterly if this wasn't cruel. But the maid explained that her duty was to meet Sieg's daily needs, nothing more. This maid, being a 3-star practitioner, could easily have taught Sieg basic combat techniques. Yet Sieg had no interest in such trivial lessons. After 7 years of living with this girl, he had grown accustomed to the same lifeless responses. Finally, Sieg decided to leave and head into the forest. The maid said nothing, simply watching as Sieg walked away. He thought irritably that she was actually going to let him go, just like that. A short while later, Sieg, now fully dressed, walked deep into the forest and was pulling up wild poisonous plants by the roots and ate them without hesitation. He was probably trying to imitate cows. As before, the taste was disgusting, but it was part of his training method. Then he suddenly noticed something. He took a deep breath, for he sensed that someone or something was watching him from afar, following his every move. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of another's presence. A few moments later, Sieg sighed. He wondered if they had really been following him all the way to this spot. When he could take it no longer, he shouted that they might as well come out if they had something to say. Then he slipped into the tall grass, hiding. A moment later, crouching in the grass, Sieg sensed a dark, oppressive aura nearby. Looking toward the source, he saw a creature known as the Boar of Fury. He wondered what kind of aura it was. The black mist surrounding the beast was something he had never seen before. Not even 1,000 years ago, while the boar was happily nibbling on the grass, Sieg suddenly stood up and gave himself away, startling the beast. And because of this, it released even more of its aura. The angry, furious boar immediately charged at him, and instead of fear, a smile appeared on Sieg's face. He was genuinely thrilled at the opportunity to fight it. The boar charged forward, but Sieg dodged swiftly, already gathering golden energy into his fist. With a powerful strike, he unleashed an explosion that tore the megaboar's body apart. He couldn't help but smirk at the sight. His attack turned out to be far stronger than he had expected. Even at the 1-star level, his strength surpassed that of most practitioners at the same level. Hoisting the slain creature onto his shoulder, Sieg muttered that things would get even better once he raised his star level. He was tired of being looked down upon. He wondered if it wasn't time to leave and set out on his own journey, perhaps heading straight for the ocean. Meanwhile, far behind him, a man in a cloak watched from the shadows. He wondered what was wrong with this boy. After all, even without formal training, he had reached the 1-star level and killed that boar with a single blow. The man was puzzled by how Sieg had sensed him. The child's mother had died young, and his father showed no interest in him. So, without a mentor, the boy shouldn't have become strong. As the illegitimate son of the head of Eldragon, Sieg was under surveillance. The man watched him from the shadows, wondering if it was his father's blood that had given the boy such immense strength. His doubts brought a smirk to his face. He thought it would be interesting to watch the boy in the future, then vanished into thin air without a trace. Upon returning home, Sieg was already packing his things, ready to set off on a journey. But suddenly he sensed several powerful presences outside. 3 4-star practitioners and 1 5-star. He tried to figure out what they were doing here. He thought, quietly approaching the door to listen. From their conversation, he heard them discussing how fresh and clean the air was in such a remote place, and how peaceful it was here due to the absence of nearby fault lines. Hearing this, Sieg concluded that they were not killers. Deciding to meet them face to face, he opened the door and asked what business they had here. The group froze in surprise. Then Sieg noticed the emblem embroidered on their clothes, the emblem of the Eldragon clan. So that's how it was. Immediately, the men stood at attention and hurriedly bowed. Their leader respectfully stated that it was an honor for them to finally meet the young Master Sieg. He added that they had been sent to escort him to the exam site. Sieg was confused upon hearing about the exam. A shadow of irritation flitted across his face. He muttered that they expected him to pass the exam, even though they hadn't taught him a damn thing yet. His angry shout could be heard throughout the neighborhood, and a few days later, Sieg could hardly believe that he had returned to the Eldragon family's main estate. After 1,700 years, we were told that he had been brought here not to live in the main estate again, but for another purpose. Before he could enter, he was told to first change out of his dirty clothes. Then they began to explain to Sieg something known as the Dragon's Nest. 1,000 years ago, the Eldragon family founded a school that served all branches of their lineage. Anyone born with any connection to the Eldragon family dreamed of entering this so-called Dragon's Nest to receive a proper education upon reaching the age of 7. And today was the day of the entrance ceremony for this academy. Sieg was here to take the entrance exam. Even though he knew nothing and had never been taught, passing the exam was mandatory. Sieg immediately lost heart when he realized that this was the real reason he had been brought here. He inwardly protested, wondering why now, of all times, when he had already decided to leave and travel the world. As he sat by the school gates, a boy from the village of Ortiskila approached him. It was Rangus, who asked if he was all right and what was troubling him. When Sieg asked who he was, the boy formally introduced himself as Rangus and said he had come over because Sieg looked troubled. Sieg casually asked if that was true and made a puzzled face. Observing the flow of energy in Rangus's body, Sieg noted to himself that the boy seemed shy but possessed an unusually keen perception. Then Sieg apologized for his position, standing up and introducing himself in return, then admitting that his mind was in chaos because he had no idea what would be required of them on the exam. Rangus asked if that was all there was to it. Slightly nervous, he nevertheless explained that the annual entrance exam for Dragon's Nest hadn't changed much. But when Sieg admitted that he knew nothing about the exam, Rangus was shocked that he was planning to take the test without any knowledge at all. Just as Rangus was about to explain the details of the exam, someone approached them, and a loud, arrogant voice suddenly interrupted them. The boastful boy shouted and called Rangus a wimp. Rangus turned around in shock and immediately recognized who it was. It was Retin, also from the village of Ortiskila. Mocking him, Retin said he must have gotten lost since he'd ended up at the Dragon's Nest, and that he'd better go home before he got hurt. Rangus replied that he had come to take the entrance exam, though his voice trembled when Retin stepped closer, asking if he was serious about taking the test. Retin clutched his stomach and burst out laughing, saying that it was impossible for him to pass the test. He even insulted Rangus's father, declaring that he was a pseudo-dragon and asking what a pseudo-dragon's son could possibly achieve. Rangus's fists trembled as he held back his anger, but Sieg noticed everything. Then they explained to us that the Eldragon family followed an absolute hierarchy. The ranks were as follows: Dragon Cub recruits, ordinary Dragon Child soldiers, slightly higher. Then came the adult Dragon captains with special abilities, followed by executive senior dragons, also known as elders. And at the very bottom of the hierarchy were the pseudo-dragons. Those who failed to enter or graduate from the Dragon's Nest were considered immature and inferior dragons. And yet, Rangus had long dreamed of proving that even if they were called pseudo-dragons, they were still dragons. Sieg was surprised and asked why Retin was so sure that Rangus would fail the exam before it even began. Retin snapped back, asking who he thought he was, and asked if Sieg had a problem with him. Sieg calmly replied that he was simply curious why Retin was so certain Rangus would fail the test. Retin pointed at Rangus and shouted that the reason was obvious. He was just a weakling. Sieg tilted his head and asked if he had really called Rangus weak, because judging by what he felt, Rangus seemed even stronger than them. The aura of the main character immediately seeped into the air. Hearing this, Rangus's eyes widened in disbelief. It was the first time anyone had stood up for him. The arrogant boys got angry and asked if Sieg was serious when he claimed they were weaker than a pseudo-dragon, a creature they considered inferior. But before the conflicts could escalate, a man arrived and drew everyone's attention by stomping loudly and shouting. It was an examiner from among the adult dragons who announced that the entrance exam for Dragon's Nest was about to begin, and that all participants must register to receive their numbers. As he left, Retin glared fiercely at Sieg and warned that he would not forget his face. Sieg sighed and said there was no need to get angry, noting that the children of this generation seemed to be so quick-tempered. Rangus quickly replied that there was nothing strange about it, since they were about the same age. He added that anyone would get angry if told they were weaker than him, and Sieg asked his new friend in surprise if that was true. Since the entrance exam was mandatory, they had no choice but to take it, although Sieg was surprised when Rangus said that, in fact, it was possible to skip the test. Sieg's eyes widened, and Rangus realized that Sieg really didn't know anything about it. Rangus advised him that it might be better to back out now before he got hurt. But Sieg confidently replied that a genius like him would never back down from a challenge. Rangus could only shake his head and say that Sieg was far too cocky, despite knowing nothing about the exam. Sieg just laughed and said that no matter what the test was like, they should hurry up since it was about to start. Rangus had no choice but to agree. He was shocked by the protagonist's confidence. When they arrived at the test site, the examiner announced that the exam was simple. To pass, they only had to scratch the stones lying behind him. However, no weapons other than those provided by the academy were allowed. Nevertheless, they were free to use their bare hands if they wished, but each participant had only 3 attempts. Sieg asked in disappointment, "Is that all? Some unexpectedly easy test?" Rangus was shocked again, and the protagonist explained. After they had survived the dragon trial while still infants, he had expected something far more terrifying and intense, but this seemed disappointingly simple. The first card flew forward. Then the examiner called the first participant and told him to begin. The boy, nervous but determined, struck the massive stone with all his might. The sound of metal striking stone echoed loudly, ringing in their ears. But to everyone's shock, the boy's sword snapped in half, and the recoil tore both his arms off. Sieg was stunned by what he saw. This was truly brutal madness. While the boy writhed in pain, the examiner calmly stated that he still had 2 attempts left and asked if he wished to continue. But since the boy could no longer stand, the examiner declared that he had failed and ordered the others to clear the area. As the injured participant was being dragged away, the next number was called. Rangus trembled with fear at what he had witnessed, while Sieg began to get annoyed. He muttered a question about whether this was what they called an exam. Then he asked what kind of stones they were. They explained to him that the stones possessed regenerative properties. Any scratches would disappear in an instant. Moreover, they could reflect physical force 100-fold if struck with power. Sieg immediately declared that such materials were clearly overkill for an entrance exam. But Rangus explained that it was still possible to scratch them if one managed to properly channel one source of power throughout the body before the attack. Sieg noted that he understood everything now. He realized that the circulation of one source of power was far more important than martial arts skills on this exam. Thinking about what to do next, he decided to take a look at the other participants and thought that only a few would pass, including those arrogant boys. As the exam continued, there were more failures than passers. Many were severely injured due to the stone's ability to deflect conventional physical attacks. Then, a few moments later, the examiner called out Sieg's number. With a calm smile, Sieg said it was his turn. Rangus, still nervous, asked if he really had no intention of backing out, but Sieg simply stepped forward, telling him not to worry. And then Rangus once again humbly accepted this as an order and backed down. When Sieg approached the examiner told him to take a weapon from the collection, but something was off. As soon as the man looked up at the protagonist, his eyes widened in shock. Sieg's aura began to flare, faintly revealing the power from his past life as a Gilfas. The examiner told him to step forward and choose a weapon, but Sieg replied that there was no need. The crowd murmured in disbelief when he declared that his fists alone would suffice. They thought that no matter how skilled he was at circulating his source of power, there was no way in the world he could scratch a stone with his bare hands. Instead, his fists would surely shatter into pieces. Some of them said that not only Sieg's fists, but his hands as well would be destroyed, which made Rangus worry deeply for him. Along with fear came anger at himself, as he believed he should have forcibly stopped Sieg to prevent him from getting hurt. And just then, the formidable examiner gave the signal to begin. Approaching the massive stone, Sieg placed his hand on it, noting that it was the first time he had seen such a material. He thought to himself that it must have formed over 1,000 years ago, and even now there were still many things about the current generation that he didn't fully understand. But that no longer mattered. He immediately gathered his source of power into his fist. While Rangus trembled with anxiety over what might happen to Sieg, our protagonist was actually brimming with excitement because, for the first time, he could use his full power. He decided to use this mysterious stone to gauge his current power. Rangus's eyes widened once more when Sieg unleashed the first form of the Dragon Destruction combat technique, Explosive Strike, against the stone. A colossal burst of energy erupted from the collision. Fragments of shattered rock flew in all directions, and the furious wind from the explosions sent dust and debris flying into the air. Awestruck, yet on guard, Rangus quickly shielded himself from the aftermath, while the examiner's eyes widened in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. As the dust began to settle, Sieg stood there with a smile on his face, noting that the technique he had used seemed to still be too complex for his current power. However, before the entire crowd of students stood a broken stone. Sieg had done it. Despite the serious injuries to his arm, he laughed at himself, realizing that he still needed far more intense training. The other participants were speechless at what they had seen. Retin looked both stunned and annoyed that Sieg had destroyed the enchanted stone. One of the girls watching commented that Sieg was indeed an interesting guy. While the others were still reeling from what had happened, Sieg eagerly waited for the examiner to announce the results. But the examiner was still in shock. The stone that Sieg had destroyed was renowned for its ability to regenerate, and it was believed that only those who had already reached the 4-star level or higher were capable of breaking it. And now standing before him was just a child who had accomplished what seemed impossible. The examiner muttered that the blood of a leader flowed through Sieg. It seemed to him that the boy's technique was strangely familiar, and he wondered about the source of this power. Still stunned, the examiner didn't answer right away. So Sieg called out impatiently, asking for the result. Coming to his senses, the examiner finally announced that Sieg had passed the test. Then, one of the examiners handed Sieg a small vial containing a green liquid. Intrigued, Sieg asked what it was, but the man merely asked if he could leave already, since Sieg was blocking the way. Annoyed, Sieg frowned and muttered, "Are all the people of this generation such rude people?" Before he could get any more upset, Rangus ran up to him excitedly, praising Sieg's performance. Sieg grinned proudly and said it was nothing. Then Sieg asked what the liquid was, and Rangus explained that it was a healing potion, a standard potion of the Eldragon family. Sieg asked again if it was indeed a healing potion. Rangus confirmed it, but since Sieg was the family's illegitimate son, he suspected it might be poison. However, since Rangus vouched for it, he wondered if it might actually be a spiritual remedy. The elixir, known as the Cloud-Piercing Tree of Clarity, was crafted from extremely rare materials and herbs that grew only in secret realms, along with the pure source of power from divine beasts and the essence of elusive phantom creatures. When used, it could heal not only fresh wounds, but also old scars and injuries. On top of that, it could enhance a person's source of power. Since the ingredients were so rare and the process so complex, such elixirs were rarely found. After drinking it, Sieg was amazed by its immediate effect on his body. He asked Rangus if it was truly a spiritual remedy. Rangus replied that he didn't know what a spiritual remedy meant, but he was certain that the Eldragon family's potions were of far higher quality than any commercial ones outside their estate. Rangus then asked if the potion's effect had really surprised Sieg that much. Sieg confirmed this, explaining that it had healed both his serious injuries and the strain from his training. However, he noted that unlike spiritual medicine, it did not seem to have strengthened his source of power. Rangus, on the other hand, said he was even more impressed by Sieg himself, to which Sieg chuckled and told him not to joke. Sieg thought to himself that the very existence of this potion showed just how far knowledge had advanced over the last 1,000 years. Rangus praised Sieg's strength again, and Sieg declared that his dream was to become the strongest of them all. Soon, the examiner announced that Retin had also passed the test, just like his companions. Sieg had expected something like this, but then Rangus trembled nervously when his number was called. Despite his fear, he gathered his courage and stepped forward. Watching his stiff movements, Sieg wondered why Rangus was so nervous, and then shouted to encourage him, telling him to believe in himself. An embarrassed Rangus asked him to speak more quietly. When Rangus chose a sword as his weapon, Sieg watched closely, wondering what he was going to do. As soon as the examiner gave the signal, Rangus attacked the stone, but, just as he expected, failed on his first try. Determined, he stood up again for another try, but his strike bounced off the stone, causing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground. His hands were shaking from the stone's repelling power. Retin and his group burst out laughing, saying that everything had gone exactly as they had expected. The son of a pseudo-dragon was nothing more than a pseudo-dragon himself. They mocked him, urging him to give up. Retin even looked at Sieg with contempt, asking if this was the very man he claimed would be able to pass, and whether Rangus was truly stronger than them. Sieg was silent for a moment, then told them to stop talking nonsense. The examiner informed Rangus that he had only one attempt left, and asked if he still wanted to continue. Rangus couldn't answer. Overcome by embarrassment and the mockery of the others, he lowered his head. But then Sieg approached him and asked what he was doing. Rangus didn't understand what he was talking about, and then the protagonist wondered why Rangus had used a sword instead of a spear, why he had chosen a weapon that didn't suit him at all, and why he had even gone into the trial without any plan. Retin watched mockingly as Sieg told Rangus that in his current state, he wouldn't even scratch the stone, no matter how many times he tried. Retin and his crew laughed again, calling Sieg an idiot and reminding him that Rangus had no idea how to use a spear. They taunted him, saying that his weak father had taught him only fencing and that switching weapons now wouldn't change the outcome in the slightest. But Sieg ignored their taunts and turned to the examiner, asking if switching weapons violated the rules. The examiner replied that it did not. Then Sieg remarked with a smirk that Rangus was very lucky. He turned to Rangus and asked if he trusted him. His eyes returned. Memories of all the humiliations he and his father had endured flashed through Rangus's mind. Gritting his teeth, he straightened up and replied that he would trust Sieg. He decided he would fight with the spear exactly as Sieg had told him. He would use the spear. The scene changed. Rangus explained that his father had never managed to enter the dragon's lair. Because of this, people called him a pseudo-dragon and mocked him. But despite all the humiliation, his father endured it all just to raise Rangus with dignity. That is why Rangus swore to prove to everyone that he, the son lovingly raised by his father, was also a true dragon. He stood up again, gripping his spear tightly in his hands, and declared that today he would prove that neither he nor his father were fakes. He also realized that if he tried again with a sword, the result would be exactly the same as before. So this time, he decided to put his complete trust in Ziku. The only problem was that he had absolutely no idea how to handle a spear. Sieg called out to him. Pointing at the enchanted stone, he told Rangus that there was nothing else he needed to do. He just had to thrust the spear straight into the stone without thinking about anything else. Sieg firmly ordered him to simply pierce it through. Rangus gripped the spear tighter. He knew that under normal circumstances, a direct strike wouldn't do the stone the slightest bit of damage, especially given its strong regenerative properties. But Sieg was the first person who had ever stood up for him, even though they had only met that very day. For him, this was something completely new and unfamiliar, and that was exactly why this time he decided to put his complete trust in Sieg and believe in his own strength. He channeled his source power into the spear and immediately noticed something strange. For years he had wielded a sword, but he had never managed to imbue it with such a vast amount of source energy, the kind of thing he was now doing with the spear without the slightest effort. With a resolute cry, Rangus unleashed all his power and struck the stone with everything he had. Retin nearly died laughing, gloating that everything had turned out exactly as he had predicted. He claimed that changing weapons wouldn't have helped him pass the test, but Rangus didn't stop. He sensed something different, something incredibly powerful. The spear in his hands felt like an extension of his own body. Then, when he thrust the weapon forward with all his might, the spear completely pierced the enchanted stone. The look of shock on Retin and his companions' faces was priceless. Even the examiners couldn't hide their amazement, utterly enthralled by what they had just witnessed. Rangus hadn't merely scratched the stone, he had pierced it right through. Sieg immediately praised him, while Rangus himself could hardly believe what he had done. Even after the examiner officially announced that he had passed, Rangus still asked incredulously if he had really succeeded. Sieg smiled, put his arm around his shoulders, and confirmed it. Overwhelmed with joy, Rangus nearly burst into tears, hugging Sieg tightly and shouting over and over that he had done it and passed the test. Retin's group, however, refused to believe it. They chalked it all up to luck, but Retin himself remained silent, trembling with rage. He couldn't accept that, just as Sieg had predicted, Rangus had actually proven stronger than them, and that his result was far better. Then the examiner announced that the test was officially over and that the admission ceremony would begin shortly. Sieg immediately asked if the test was truly over. Rangus replied that it seemed so, but added that there would likely be other trials once they entered the dragon's lair. Soon, a group of men emerged from the dark corridor. When they stepped into the light, the examiner announced that the head of the Eldragon family would now give a speech to congratulate those who had passed the selection. As soon as Sieg saw this man, he asked who this person with such a cold, gloomy expression was. Rangus, clearly nervous, replied that it was the head of the family himself. Sieg voiced his surprise that it was the head of the family and wondered why he looked that way, since he wasn't even smiling and seemed colder than ice. Rangus immediately covered Sieg's mouth, whispering that he'd better keep quiet, and pleaded again for him to stop talking. Sieg nodded. Glancing at the group again, he noted that these people represented the current might of the Eldragon family. Some of them were at the 7-star level, while others were at the 6-star level. The protagonist was shocked and fell deep in thought. To Sieg, their strength was impressive, especially considering that the current head of the family, Gilfas Eldragon, was a powerful 8-star level fighter. 1,000 years ago, only a handful of people had reached that level, and Sieg wasn't sure how many such masters existed in the current era. Sieg muttered that he didn't like this head of the family. But before he could continue, Reincarnated tried to shut him up again. Sieg sighed and thought to himself that he never expected this man to turn out to be his father in this life. A dark, fiery aura emanated from Gilfas' body, making the air around him feel heavy. The examiner hurriedly ordered everyone to remain silent, because Mr. Gilfas was about to speak. When Gilfas stepped forward, he spoke only a few words about how they were all meant to strive to become the flesh and blood of the Eldragon family. As he spoke, the terrifying pressure of his aura spread throughout the hall. It had no effect on Sieg, but many of the examinees trembled with fear, gasping for breath and stiffening under this colossal pressure. Sieg noticed that it had even affected Reincarnated. He shrank back and couldn't believe how easily everyone around him had succumbed to the pressure of the family head's presence. Moreover, Sieg sensed a strong hatred hidden within Gilfas' aura, though he did not know its cause. But even so, he couldn't bring himself to feel any sympathy for the man who was supposedly his father. When Gilfas turned away, another man stepped forward and drew everyone's attention. He had blonde hair, and he cheerfully thanked Gilfas for his words. Then he announced that Master Gilfas had high hopes for all of them, and that, like his master, he too would keep his speech brief. While Sieg wondered who this man was, the speaker simply told everyone to train hard and become stronger. One of the examiners muttered, "Is that all there was to it?" The man smiled and remarked that people who worry too much about trifles go bald early, so he didn't bother with long speeches. Sieg couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, but at least the tension in the room had eased, and now they sat quietly alongside Reincarnated, who was stealing glances at the protagonist. Then the examiner announced that the new students would now be assigned to their dormitories, and everyone whose number was called was to head there immediately. Sieg asked if they wouldn't be living in the same dormitory. Reincarnated explained that there were 4 buildings, east, west, south, and north, and every incoming student was allowed to live in one of them. When Sieg's number was called, he stood up and waved goodbye to Reincarnated. They congratulated each other and told each other to take care. The scene changed. In the end, he was assigned to the East building. Walking down the hallway, he noted to himself that a lot had changed in this place over the last 1,000 years. Finding his room, he figured he must have gotten lost since it had taken him so long to get there, and his roommate had probably arrived first. He reached for the doorknob. Opening the door, he cheerfully greeted his new roommate, apologizing for being late and adding that from that day on, they would be sharing a room. But he froze when he saw who was in his room. A familiar face. But to his surprise, his new roommate turned out to be none other than Reincarnated himself. Sieg couldn't help but laugh, noting that it seemed fate itself kept bringing them together. His new roommate said that was good. He would have been scared to live here alone. He asked if anything else was planned for that day, and Reincarnated confirmed that their training would begin tomorrow. Sieg casually asked if that was true, prompting Reincarnated to inquire whether he hadn't been listening to the examiner's recent explanations. Sieg admitted that he hadn't been listening on purpose. Reincarnated sighed and said that wasn't something to brag about. Then, while Sieg was looking out the window, he suggested they go to bed early since training was starting the next day. He was thinking about his plan to escape from the Eldragon family and set off to travel the world. But after learning about the enchanted stone with regenerative properties and the healing potion, he realized he had discovered many interesting things during the exam. If he really wanted to understand all the changes that had taken place over the last 1,000 years, he thought, then perhaps staying with the Eldragon family for a while wasn't such a bad idea after all. The scene had changed. A month had passed at the academy, and their training was becoming increasingly rigorous. As the students held heavy dumbbells in both hands, the instructor explained that the dragon's breath he was teaching them was one of the most important techniques ever created by the 15th head of the Eldragon family. Reminding them that they had to master this technique under any circumstances, the instructor turned his attention to several students. He noticed that some of them had already mastered the dragon's breath, especially a young girl he called Miss Leica, whose overflowing energy suggested she was close to reaching the 2-star level. But besides her, another student caught his attention. Sieg was training not only by holding dumbbells, but also by balancing large stones on his head and arms, which the instructor could hardly believe. The blood of the family head truly flowed through Sieg's veins. However, it was rumored that no one had taught Sieg anything since childhood, so everything he was now witnessing seemed unfamiliar to him. Sieg, on the other hand, couldn't believe that the technique he had once called the Dragon King's breathing technique had been refined by subsequent heads of the family and was now being taught to other branches as well. In Sieg's view, breathing techniques were methods of gathering source energy from the environment into the body, which, as it circulated, amplified a person's own internal energy. The effectiveness of such techniques depended on a person's abilities and intellect, which is why the great families of this world kept their techniques secret, never allowing outsiders to learn them. Sieg realized that the dragon's breath was a safe and simple technique, but it was useless to him if it could only be used while resting. His own version of the breathing technique allowed him to manipulate the surrounding source energy even while moving, which made it far more complex and powerful in actual combat, but also much harder to master. Only a few had ever mastered it. He thought that the current generation must have simplified his original version so that even members of the family's collateral branches could learn it, and this decision had clearly helped strengthen the Eldragon family. Sieg couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction, as he could never have imagined that the techniques he had discovered long ago would still have an impact 1,000 years later. This made him wonder if the other martial arts techniques he had created had also evolved over time, and he became genuinely absorbed in this thought. Leica, meanwhile, quietly watched Sieg from a distance. Later, after training, the scene shifted to the dining hall, where all the other students were amazed by how much food Sieg was devouring. There were piles of plates near his table, and the protagonist's mouth wouldn't stop, taking in tons of food. As he continued to devour his portion, he noticed Reincarnated sitting silently across from him. Sieg asked what was wrong, and added that he wouldn't get strong if he didn't eat. Reincarnated simply asked if Sieg didn't find his stamina strange. Sieg replied that if he wanted to get stronger, he just needed to eat more, train harder, and push himself. He even offered Reincarnated some of his food, but Reincarnated politely declined, saying he had enough. While Sieg was thinking about how some of the students had been well-trained even before entering the academy, a girl suddenly approached them. In a calm but confident tone, Leica remarked that he was quite impressive, even cool. Sieg blinked and casually asked who she actually was. Reincarnated immediately choked on his food, whispering nervously, "Didn't Sieg know that this was Lady Leica, the daughter of Lord Balza, the head of the family?" Sieg reacted indifferently, asking what he was supposed to do about it, since he didn't know her. Reincarnated began to sweat profusely, warning that he shouldn't have spoken that way, since Lady Leica was one of the candidates for the position of the next head of the family, and was not someone with whom one could speak so casually. Sieg replied that he too was the head of a family's child, albeit an illegitimate one. Reincarnated froze in shock, while Leica looked at him curiously, asking if it was true. Now it was time to turn to the girl. Leica Tefina Eldragon, one of the candidates to inherit the Eldragon family, now stood right in front of Sieg. Shrugging, Sieg asked why he would lie about it, prompting Leica to demand an explanation of how an illegitimate child could have destroyed the magic stone with his bare hands, and, in general, how a bastard possessed such power. Confidently replying that it was because he was Sieg, he turned to Reincarnated and told him to stop staring and finish his meal. Both Leica and Reincarnated fell silent for a moment, stunned. Then Leica suddenly smiled, and, noting that he was indeed an interesting person, she sat down next to him and offered him a position as one of her followers. Sieg raised an eyebrow, asking what exactly she meant. She explained that she wanted to make him her ally and become his patron. She offered to use his power to help her become the next head of the family, promising in return to help him fulfill his own dreams. The girl was already rejoicing, anticipating their alliance, but Sieg didn't even hesitate and flatly refused. Frowning again, Leica asked why that was, and then, with a suspicious and menacing look, she pressed him, asking if he himself wanted to become the head of the family. When her aura flared with a faint, crackling energy, Sieg realized she was close to reaching the 2-star level, and for someone her age, that was truly impressive. Nevertheless, Sieg remained calm, stating that she could do whatever she pleased, but he wasn't interested in being the head of the family or any other title. Leica coldly asked why, to which Sieg abruptly jerked his hand, still holding the tools, near her face. In doing so, he plunged his knife into the table and drew her attention to himself. In his calm but sharp voice, he replied that he didn't need to serve anyone, since he himself was the strongest man in the world. Silence fell over the dining hall. The protagonist's monstrous aura weighed heavily on everyone, They were all speechless. Even Leica couldn't believe what she was feeling, as Zik's presence had completely overwhelmed her for a moment. Rangus immediately stepped in to defuse the situation, urging them both to calm down. But Leica wasn't the type to back down, so, embarrassed and angry at what had happened, she decided to challenge Zik to a duel. Zika, however, didn't care at all, and he simply continued eating. A moment later, a stir swept across campus. Students were finding out that a duel was to take place on the training grounds, and were amazed that Lady Leica of the Tiffin family herself would be fighting, wondering who had been brave enough to challenge her. When they arrived at the training ground, everyone was whispering among themselves, wondering who would step up against her. Zeke, meanwhile, couldn't believe that Leica was really serious about the duel. Nervously asking if he was okay with all this, Rangus reminded him that he would be fighting Lady Leica, to which Zik replied bluntly that he still had no idea who she was. Sighing, Rangus remarked that he should at least show a little respect, since it turned out he was also the son of the family head, but Zik just waved him off. Nevertheless, Rangus tried to explain. Lady Leica was the daughter of Lord Balza, a child prodigy who had mastered all the forms of the Tiffin family's hereditary two-handed thundersword technique and possessed a frightening talent. Zik tilted his head to one side, admitting that he hadn't understood a word of it, except that she was the head of the family's daughter. Rangus stared at him, puzzled as to how anyone could be unaware of all this, to which Zik asked him not to ask any more questions about it. Rangus blinked when Zik suddenly laughed right in front of him, and added with a smirk that since he knew nothing about her, it would only make the fight more fun and exciting. All Rangus could do was sigh with concern, because no matter how strong Zik was, Lady Leica was on a completely different level. He asked why Zik had accepted her challenge in the first place, to which he replied that he never ran from a fight, and his opponent was ready anyway. At that moment, Leica stood with her sword firmly planted in the ground, her aura blazing, while lightning crackled faintly around her. She asked coldly if they were done talking. Leica shouted, asking if they were finally done talking, and Zik replied that he was ready. Rangus, trembling with fear and shock, and immediately ran away from them, warning Zik to be careful in battle. Then Zik turned to Leica and asked why she was so determined to fight him. Leica explained that she wanted to become the next head of the Eldragon family, and to achieve that, she needed to defeat Zik and make him one of her followers. Zik asked what she meant, wondering what role he played in her dream. Leica replied by asking him if he really had no idea about the current state of affairs in their family, probably because he was a bastard. Zik simply admitted that his knowledge of the family was very limited. Because of this, Leica began to explain. She said that, including the two of them, there were 5 candidates for the position of the next family head. With the exception of Zik, all of her brothers and sisters were connected to the 4 main branches of the Eldragon clan. A fierce struggle for the position of family head had driven Zik's relatives into the dragon's lair. Leica, on the other hand, needed strong allies against her older brothers. Zik quickly realized that this was a power struggle between the 4 main branches of the Eldragon family. He found it all too complicated and wasn't even sure he wanted to get involved. Leica then continued, stating that as a candidate, she needed to strengthen not only her power, but also her influence by gathering strong followers. In an instant, only dust remained where the girl had stood, and her shadow was already falling on the protagonist's face. Without a word, she lunged straight at Zik, declaring that she would defeat him right here and now to make him her subordinate. But Zik easily dodged her powerful blow, as well as the barrage of attacks that followed. However, Leica had no intention of giving up or letting him slip away. The spectators couldn't believe what they were seeing. The speed of their movements was incredible. Leica's attacks, despite her heavy two-handed sword, flowed so smoothly and swiftly that they seemed almost effortless. Watching the battle, the crowd began to whisper about Leica's precise control over her source power. Noticing how her strikes were becoming faster and stronger, they could only marvel at the power of the true daughter of the head of the main branch of the family. Some even whispered that the outcome of the fight was already obvious. What they didn't know was that Leica herself was growing increasingly frustrated. She couldn't understand how Ziku managed to dodge every one of her attacks, or why it seemed as though he was simply toying with her. Rangus, watching from a distance, couldn't hide his amazement. His earlier anxieties vanished when he saw Zik's calm movements. Then Zik noted that the martial arts Leica was using were unlike anything he had seen before. He admitted that her movements were much faster than those of any ordinary one-star fighter, but an irritated Leica shouted at him to shut up and focus on their fight. Zik clenched his fist and said that he was already focused, and that was exactly why he had been able to land such a powerful blow so easily. His blow hit its mark precisely. It seemed as though it could have pierced right through his opponent, and Laika immediately gasped from the force of the blow. She fell to her knees, clutching her sword and her stomach in pain. The spectators gasped and began whispering among themselves, wondering how Sieg had managed to dodge all her attacks and who this guy really was. Trying to stand up, Laika asked why none of her strikes had hit their mark. Compared to other one-star fighters, she knew she was much faster. So logically, Sieg shouldn't have been able to keep up with her. Sieg admitted that she was indeed faster than any one-star master he had ever seen. But in his eyes, she was still only a one-star. Laika snapped back that he was also just a one-star, adding that he shouldn't have been able to match her in speed. Sieg replied that there was a simple reason for this. He could read her breathing, eye movements, and muscle contractions. And by observing these details, he could predict her next move based on his experience. Shouting that he shouldn't make fun of her, Laika landed another quick blow on him, but Sieg dodged it easily again, saying that, just as he'd claimed a moment ago, he could see and read her every move. In the next instant, he launched a powerful counterattack, rising onto his hands and parrying the sword. And then he launched a swift and unexpected attack at her stomach again. And the blow, with monstrous force, sent Laika crashing into the wall, raising a cloud of dust. And the protagonist was still standing in his stance. It seemed as if smoke was rising from his fist. The shocked spectator screamed, asking, "Is Laika really defeated? It can't be!" At that moment, Rangis shouted with delight that Sieg had won. But Sieg calmly replied that it wasn't over yet, and their fight wasn't finished. When the dust settled, Laika got back to her feet, battered but determined. Sieg noted that she had concentrated her source power in her core, which had allowed her to withstand the attack without serious injury. He smiled slightly and acknowledged that Laika was truly an outstanding girl. But she seemed badly beaten and exhausted. Rangis begged Laika to stop, but Sieg ordered him to step back, warning that he might get caught in the crossfire. Then Sieg noticed an intense surge of aura emanating from Laika. He had already suspected as much. And then the protagonist wondered if she had just advanced to the 2-star level. The spectators noticed it too, and there was no mistaking it. The glowing mark on her body was proof that she had reached the 2-star level with a white aura. The 2-star level was a stage at which one could channel the power of the source into martial arts, manifesting it externally as an aura. Laika thanked Sieg, saying that thanks to him, she had reached the 2-star level sooner than she had expected. But because of that, she declared, he no longer had any chance of winning. With a blazing aura, she lunged at Sieg, her two-handed sword surrounded by glowing energy. Sieg just laughed, looking genuinely excited, and, dodging her, remarked enthusiastically that she had indeed improved, and her speed had become incredible. But his expression suddenly changed. Lightning flashed, and he felt a burning sensation on his cheek, a shallow cut. She had gotten him after all. But how? Sieg thought to himself that he was certain he had dodged that attack. The girl asked him what he thought of that trick. He surely hadn't expected it. She moved closer to him. Laika smirked, and proudly declaring that this was her true ability. And now that she had reached 2 stars, she promised to show him the true power of the genuine thunderous two-handed sword technique. Sieg remarked with a joyful smile that in that case, he would get to witness a martial art he had never seen before. And for him, this turned out to be the most thrilling moment of the battle. Laika suddenly employed the thunderous two-handed sword technique, flash of lightning. As she lunged forward, her sword crackled with blinding golden energy. Sieg was instantly engulfed by a thunderstorm, forcing him to retreat, as he shouted questions about how she could control lightning like that, and whether it wasn't a bit much for a sparring match. Laika smirked, plunging her sword into the ground, and calmly acknowledged his surprise by using another technique. Lightning net. Sparks burst from the ground, forming an electric web that he barely dodged. Landing, he muttered to himself that her power had increased tremendously, and at this rate, the fight wouldn't be easy. The crowd whispered in awe, unable to hide their astonishment. Ever since Laika had advanced to the 2-star level, the course of the battle had completely changed. Rangis, watching the events unfold with concern, began to worry about his new friend. Sieg noticed that Laika's movements were simple, nothing new compared to her 1-star form. But every swing of her blade now carried far greater power. Her thunderous two-handed sword technique was brimming with power, and her aura amplified every strike. But what surprised Sieg even more was her speed. Laika moved faster than he could have anticipated, and her lightning seemed strangely enigmatic. Nevertheless, he remained confident. Even if she could hide behind thunder, he was sure he could stand up to her. And yet, he was filled with curiosity. He wondered what kind of power this was, and what kind of lightning she could command. Dodging her relentless attacks, he studied her every movement, analyzing her aura and its rhythm. Leica, noticing Zick's calm smile, frowned and asked with a smirk why he looked too relaxed for a duel, suggesting they see how long that would last. She said she would make sure the protagonist couldn't laugh anymore. She lunged forward again, enveloping herself in golden lightning. But Zick dodged again at the very last moment. He thought she was as fast as lightning itself, but Leica suddenly swung her sword right on the fly. This time, the strike was accurate, and Zick flew backward along with a powerful shockwave that scattered dust across the entire field. Rangis gasped and rushed towards Zick in panic, but one of the spectators grabbed his arm to stop him. Meanwhile, Zick got to his feet. His clothes were scorched, but his resolve remained unshaken. Leica attacked again, unleashing another flash of lightning and striking him in the forehead. And yet, even after that, Zick still stood firmly on his feet. Furrowing her brows in bewilderment, Leica couldn't understand how he was still holding on. Rangis ran toward them, begging Lady Leica to stop since they had already witnessed her power. But Leica snapped coldly, asking if he didn't understand that stopping in the middle of the fight would be an insult to Zick. In desperation, Rangis turned to Zick and began begging him to surrender. Leica smirked, agreeing that surrendering would be wise, and promised to stop if he knelt and swore his loyalty to her. But Zick merely smiled silently. Leica's eyes hardened, and with a touch of mockery, she noted that he was truly a proud Eldragon, raising his sword high and declaring that he would use all his strength to end this. Lightning roared from the heavens as Leica summoned her first secret art, Heavenly Thunder. A massive wave of golden energy crashed down, shattering the stones beneath Zick's feet. The lightning strike crashed into his body in a storm of divine fury. Rangis screamed in horror as he watched his friend's body engulfed by golden lightning, and smoke rose from his charred form. The protagonist now simply lay on the ground. Leica thrust her sword into the ground, exhaled deeply, and said quietly that she was sorry. But for Zick, this was the end. But then, through the crackling air, a voice rang out, asking ironically if that was really the case. In an instant, a shining golden aura of lightning shot up into the sky. Leica's eyes widened in shock as she turned around and, stammering, began to ask where he had gotten the lightning aura from and how had he even managed to survive the thunderclap. Zick stood there, smiling calmly, while golden arcs danced across his skin. He casually remarked that so this was what she called a lightning aura, and admitted that he honestly didn't know how he'd gotten it. His tone was calm. Leica whispered that it was impossible, unable to believe her eyes. Zick grinned, revealing the truth. He had let her strike him on purpose to study her lightning, and somehow learned to use it himself. Leica snapped back, calling it absurd. Internally, Zick explained to himself that he had deliberately taken Leica's blows because her lightning had intrigued him. As he withstood her strikes, he continuously activated his Dragon King breathing technique. A strange resonance between his breathing and her lightning caused golden energy to accumulate in his body. Before he knew it, he was already able to control the lightning himself. He thought that Leica had a unique physique, and it was quite likely that her entire lineage shared this affinity with lightning. Zeke confidently headed toward her, noting that he had never expected the power of a lightning-type source to be so incredible, and that this duel had become the perfect moment for his training. He had learned a lot. With a smirk, he added words of thanks to Leica for something. He admitted that he himself had reached the 2-star level and declared that their battle was not yet over. But suddenly he noticed something rapidly approaching him. It was Leica, who roared and charged again, unleashing another blinding attack. But Zick effortlessly stepped aside and prepared for a counterattack. However, as soon as he moved, he suddenly vanished in a flash and reappeared at the opposite end of the arena. He muttered, not understanding what had just happened. He realized that the immense power of the source was strengthening his muscles, and surmised that the new lightning aura had altered his physiology. Zick noted that he couldn't yet fully control his speed. In the stands, Rangis was speechless. He could no longer keep track of their movements, as both fighters had merged into blurry blobs of golden light and thunder. He wondered if it seemed to him that Leica hadn't landed a single accurate blow lately. Disappointed, Leica cried out, asking Zick if he was mocking her. She demanded that he stop playing games with her. Zick calmly replied that he wasn't playing games at all. However, he acknowledged her as a real threat, then lunged forward, delivering a powerful kick. Leica blocked the lunge with her sword, but the force of the blow still sent her flying backward. Zick straightened up, smiling slightly. He declared that, in his opinion, it was time to end this, and added that he had long been thinking about creating a new technique, and this moment seemed perfect to him. The girl asked with extreme skepticism about creating a completely new technique. Sieg nodded, confirming her guess. He fell silent for a moment, then muttered, wondering whether to call it the first form or a special form. Leica blinked in confusion, wondering if he had even received proper combat training. Her thoughts were jumbled as she tried to figure out in which family he could have learned such things. Suddenly appearing beside her, Sieg, with a lightning bolt in his hand, shouted the name of the attack. Lightning Peak Special Form. Her eyes widened as the light from his attack fell on her face. The attack struck her right on target, enveloping the girl in a furious storm of sparkling golden thunder. Her body shook violently. The sword slipped from her hands, and she fell to her knees before him amid crackling electricity. The entire arena instantly fell into dead silence. Rangus was in shock, and the rest of the spectators watched in obvious disbelief. For Sieg had won an uncontested victory. Lying on the ground, Leica gasped for breath, wondering if she had lost. And after a few moments, trembling, she forced herself to sit up. She couldn't believe she had lost, for she was the one destined to become the next rightful head of the family. With bitterness in her heart, she thought about how she absolutely could not afford to lose to anyone. She still had to defeat her brothers. Sieg approached her and, extending his hand, sincerely praised Leica for being simply amazing. Calling her truly strong, he added that learning something new in a fight was always incredibly exciting. With a warm smile, he admitted that this past match was definitely worth all the effort. He suggested they have another sparring session sometime, noting that it would be boring to end things with just this fight. Leica froze, her cheeks flushed, looking at his hand without any malice, despite her loss. Perhaps it was because of wounded pride, or perhaps she was experiencing genuine admiration for the first time. Sieg suggested again that they have another sparring match soon, while everyone watched them, and the protagonist added with a confident smile that he was looking forward to the fight. Slightly embarrassed, Leica held out her hand to him, admitting that she couldn't compete with him, and willingly accepted defeat. Meanwhile, in the Gilfas Eldragon chasm, a huge army of some kind of creatures, Leica and Zika's father and head of the family stood surrounded by these wild monsters. And when the creatures finally rushed at him, the eyes of the great and terrible leader of Gilfas lit up, and he froze them with a wave of his aura, drawing his sword. He also summoned a dragon. Using Genesis, the first form of the dragon's destruction, he charged forward, and swinging his sword with great force, cut all the monsters around him in half with a single stroke. And when the first wall of monsters had been cut down, the chieftain suddenly sheathed his sword back under his cloak. While soldiers ran in droves and finished off the surviving monsters, Gilfas headed toward the exit from the dimension, a huge rift in space. But one of his subordinates called out to him with a report. Gilfas stopped to hear what was going on, and the soldier informed him that Lady Leica had reached the 2-star level. Upon hearing this news, Gilfas froze mid-step. His glowing eyes flickered, and he replied with extreme coldness. He asked what of it, to which the nervous soldier replied that such a rank at 7 years old was an outstanding achievement. The soldier added that Leica's talent would allow her to reach 4 or 5 stars, but Gilfas' response was chilling. Gilfas declared that talent was irrelevant, and next time, he expected to hear how she could be of use to him. He ordered him to leave if he brought only useless news, and the soldier fell silent as Gilfas walked toward the exit. Before Gilfas left, the soldier hastily added a remark about Leica's recent loss, causing the head of the family to stop abruptly. Gilfas turned his head slightly and asked if she had lost to one of her brothers. The soldier shook his head, telling his master that the situation was quite different. He explained that she had been defeated by a boy her own age, namely Lord Sieg, his other son. Upon hearing that name, Gilfas quietly asked if he was indeed referring to Sieg. Recalling the humble servant, Sieg's mother, he asked whether the soldier meant that very woman's son. Gilfas muttered that the woman had been gifted in combat, but unfortunately had died immediately after the boy's birth. Turning sharply to the soldier, he demanded to know who could have taught Sieg to defeat 2-star cultivators. The soldier hesitated slightly before answering, but eventually admitted to the Lord that no one had taught the boy this. He explained that Lord Sieg had received no formal training and had defeated Lady Leica solely through his own strength. Upon learning that the boy had also reached the 2-star level, Gilfas replied dryly that he understood everything perfectly well. Turning away again, he ordered the first trial to begin immediately, which clearly stunned the soldier standing nearby. Apologizing for the interruption, the soldier asked if it wasn't too soon, since only a month had passed since training began. He pointed out that most of them hadn't even reached the 1-star level yet, but Gilfas cut him off harshly mid-sentence. Balza declared that he didn't care, since death never chooses a time, a level, or favorites. In his words, only the strong survive, and star levels mean nothing if the students fail the test. He added that the losers were unworthy of the name Eldragon, to which the soldier hastily and unconditionally agreed. Balza then ordered him to summon Freya as well, and convey to her the order to return to the residence immediately. The soldier's eyes widened in utter surprise when he heard Freya's name. He asked doubtfully if the master meant that very Freya, to which Balza nodded affirmatively. He concluded that if Sieg had defeated Leica on his own, then this boy was far more interesting than he had expected. Balza wanted Freya to personally design the first trial and closely supervise each participant. The soldier bowed deeply and said he would carry out the order, and for the first time in a long while, a rare smile appeared on Balza's lips, and he gently called the boy the most interesting of them all. The scene changed abruptly. The next day at the academy, the students continued their training, and even Ragnas was trying his hardest, but Zika was nowhere to be seen. He stood off to the side, practicing a breathing technique. Sitting in a chair-like pose against the wall, he balanced a boulder on his head while holding dumbbells, which drew the silent attention of the others. Closing his eyes, Zeke reflected on the Strike Dragon martial arts they were studying, created by the 15th head of the family. Although the technique was called a martial art, it was a simple method of physical conditioning for children. Rangus called out to Zik, asking if he wasn't going to train, at which point Zik opened one eye. Zik asked what he meant, and Rangus clarified that he was referring to the group's current combat training. Rangus reminded him that they were practicing the Strike Dragon martial arts, but Zik casually replied that he had already mastered them. Rangus was stunned and asked again in surprise. He couldn't understand how Zeke could have already mastered this technique, since they had only been taught it that very morning. Smiling, Zik explained that it was because he was who he was, and added that Rangus's source power was currently flowing incorrectly. Puzzled, Rangus asked what exactly was flowing incorrectly. Removing the boulder from his head, Zik ordered Rangus to turn around, and suddenly a powerful yellow flash appeared. Zik had directed his aura through Rangus's back, correcting the flow of energy. When he was done, he explained that this was exactly how his aura should circulate. A grateful Rangus turned to him, remarking admiringly that Zik had truly mastered the new technique to perfection. Calling it incredible, he saw Zik jokingly ask if Rangus really doubted him and what kind of friend he was then. Rangus hastily assured him that he didn't doubt him at all. It was just that, apart from his father, no one had ever taught him in such detail. He admitted that he wanted to learn everything, especially since Zik had his own techniques capable of defeating Lady Leica. Rangus thought this technique was too simple for Zik, but Zik objected, saying it wasn't boring at all. Zik noted that he admired its consistency and that it reminded him of his dragon-slaying martial arts. He added that his children had never liked this technique, as they found it too complicated. This technique was complex and demanding, but possessed immense power. And during the battle with Leica, Zik created its 5th form. Besides, there was another secret, its final form, the very one with which he had once slain the divine dragon. He silently wondered how his descendants had eventually handled his other techniques over time, perhaps modifying them. This thought inspired him even more, but aloud, he said that since he had mastered the technique, he would continue his training. Smiling slightly, he remarked that everyone had their own way of learning techniques. But before he could continue, Rangus suddenly cried out his name desperately, begging for help. He asked Zik to teach him, admitting that it was a shameless request, but he really wanted to become stronger. Wanting to become even a little stronger, Rangus waited for an answer, and Zik, looking at him for a moment, nodded. Zik agreed to train him. Rangus couldn't believe it, and asked again if Zik was serious and if he would really teach him. Zik confirmed this and asked why Rangus looked so surprised. Zik reminded him that Rangus had asked for it himself. In response to Rangus's confusion, Zik assured him that he wasn't lying. Zik added that he knew Rangus was worth teaching, and just then, Leica approached them. Hesitating slightly, she spoke up and asked Zik to teach her as well. Frightened, Rangus turned to her and asked if Lady Leica really wanted that too. Leica calmly asked if there was a problem with that. She honestly admitted that she used to consider herself invincible and, as a candidate for the position of leader, was confident in her strength. However, yesterday's match had completely shattered her pride. She added that she still didn't understand why he controlled the lightning aura better than she did, to which Zik merely sighed. Zik muttered half-jokingly, asking if it was his fault now. Full of determination, Leica continued, declaring her desire to become stronger. She wanted to become strong enough to defeat their older brothers, as well as Zik himself. She asked him again to be her teacher, and Sieg fell silent for a moment. Since Sieg didn't answer right away, Leica asked thoughtfully if he really agreed to teach his rival. Reincarnated supported her, realizing that despite his status as a bastard, Sieg's father was still Gilfas Eldragon. Technically, this made Sieg one of the family's rightful heirs, whether he liked it or not. Sieg calmly replied that he had no objection, but expressed doubt about Leica's readiness for training due to her recent injuries. Leica shook her head, saying she had drunk a healing potion, after which Sieg and Reincarnated exchanged glances and began whispering. Sieg was surprised by the potion's absurd effectiveness, but Reincarnated noted that a basic potion from the exam wasn't capable of that. As the head of the family's daughter, Leica had certainly used a much more powerful and high-quality type of healing potion. Sieg sighed in amazement, acknowledging the uniqueness of the era, and Leica added that without the potion, she would have been bedridden for at least a month. However, her main concern now was whether Sieg would agree to take her on as a student and train her on par with the others. She understood perfectly well that he needed training too, but she still desperately wanted to become stronger under his guidance. Sieg agreed without hesitation, saying that he never turns down ambitious young people, which greatly surprised both of them. They pointed out that he was young too, and their age, to which Sieg merely smiled and agreed with them. In a teasing tone, Sieg asked if she was sure about her choice of instructor, since he was the one who had just recently defeated her. Leica replied firmly that she didn't care, since she currently had no luxury of being picky. She needed to become stronger for the sake of the title of head of the family, as she had mentioned during their very first meeting. When asked about the reasons for such obsession, Leica replied that if she failed, she would simply be used for a marriage of convenience. She added bitterly that, at best, she would be married off to a cousin, and at worst, to a complete stranger. Sieg's face darkened with anger, and he demanded an explanation, to which Leica reminded him of the value of the Eldragon lineage. Their source power was truly special, and it could be used in countless different ways. The family was obsessed with the purity of their blood, which caused Sieg to radiate a frightening aura that made Reincarnated shudder violently. In a cold tone, Sieg condemned the family's despicable actions and clenched his fists, vowing to destroy these filthy traditions. Before the atmosphere could grow even heavier, several instructors arrived, and Sieg froze in horror. Leica blinked in surprise, not understanding the reason. Sieg muttered something about bad timing, fearing they had overheard his words, when suddenly, a red-haired woman appeared behind them. The instructor announced the arrival of a new mentor, to whom the students should be grateful for taking the time to meet with them personally. The tall, red-haired female instructor approached and extended her hand to Leica, calling her by name. But Leica, sensing a wave of danger, instinctively jumped back. Sieg stepped in to protect her, and a frightened Reincarnated clung to him, while the woman smiled faintly, praising Leica's reaction and aura. Sieg frowned slightly, realizing that until that very moment, he hadn't even sensed her unexpected presence. Trembling nervously, Reincarnated asked who she was, and the instructor solemnly introduced the newcomer as Lady Freya. Freya of the Black Dragon Corps smiled politely and greeted those present, expressing her joy at meeting them. She looked directly at Sieg, and when he confirmed his name, she asked if he was surprised by her sudden appearance. Sieg calmly replied that her actions were not surprising, and, his eyes shining, called her technique of stealth interesting. Freya understood the reason for Balza's interest in this boy, while Sieg himself carefully analyzed her movements. He noticed a flow of source energy in the lower part of her body that was unfamiliar to him, which was why the woman's footsteps were completely silent. A genuine interest in her martial arts flashed in his eyes, after which Freya officially took command of the class. She confirmed her status as their new instructor, which sparked a flurry of whispers of complete disbelief among the students. Another instructor confirmed that Freya Stormwind was a 6-star practitioner from the elite Black Dragon Corps. The students were in awe, not understanding why a warrior of such rank would teach at the academy, and Freya confirmed it with a smile. She enjoyed her popularity, and she addressed all the students again and set a condition. They had to pass a simple test, which made all the students gasp in unison. It was so sudden. She tried to calm them down, assuring them that the upcoming test would be completely simple and wouldn't require any unnecessary anxiety. They had to protect a crystal and survive for a month on Poison Dragon Mountain, which made Reincarnated turn pale and Sieg feel a pang of nostalgia. He explained that the mountain was teeming with all sorts of poisonous creatures, and even a light touch to a local leaf could instantly kill a person. In this zone of pure danger, Sieg had often spent time in his past life, using the mountain as his personal training ground. Nevertheless, he considered the trial too harsh for the youngsters, after which Freya began explaining the basic rules. Each student would receive one crystal ball, and if it was lost or broken, the participant would be disqualified. Freya stated outright that those disqualified would be expelled from the nest, but added that they needn't worry about the poison itself. According to her, proper use of the dragon's breath breathing technique and keeping the orb safe would guarantee their survival. Leica reminded them of the monsters, and Freya replied sharply that they would have to kill them on their own to get food. Without constant hunting, they wouldn't last more than a few days in the mountains, which sent the students into a state of utter terror. Retin muttered about the impossibility of the task, and many doubted that the basic strike dragon technique would even wound the local beasts. Freya smirked and told them to stop panicking, adding that they had exactly 5 days to prepare for the trial. During this time, everyone could choose and study a basic martial art from the family archives to improve their chances of survival. She also refused to take responsibility for those who failed, and one of the students timidly asked if she would help in case of danger. Freya smiled grimly, reminding them that in the dragon's nest, on their family's sacred lands, the weak don't last long. She declared that only the strong survive, and that those incapable of defeating a couple of monsters would be better off falling peacefully asleep on a bed of poison right away. The students trembled with fear. Rangus was on the verge of tears, while Leica remained silent, lost in deep thought. Sieg frowned, wondering if this was the Eldragon family he had known, for so much had changed since his reign. Freya finished her speech and began handing out martial arts books for all types of weapons, inviting them to choose a technique. Some had already taken their books, while others stood there, unable to decide what to choose. While the students crowded around, Sieg advised the hesitant Rangus to choose the spear technique, the very one he had used in the exam. Rangus thanked him and agreed, while Leica decided to choose the two-handed sword technique, since she already knew its basic forms. However, Sieg stopped her and suggested she try the art of the axe, quickly explaining that it would help conceal her current weaknesses, and turned away. Leica trusted Sieg's words and nodded silently, not arguing while the protagonist was deciding what to choose. After that, Freya asked if everyone had already chosen the books they needed. Upon receiving confirmation, she told them to make good use of the remaining 5 days, since their survival depended on these techniques. The students immediately broke out in a cold sweat. After warning them of a miserable death if they failed, Freya turned to leave, but suddenly remembered one detail and spun around. She warned them that the upperclassmen would try to steal their orbs, prompting a stunned Rangus to ask for a detailed explanation. Freya explained that a group of 10-year-old upperclassmen would undergo the same trial, but their goal would be to hunt and steal the balls from the younger students. She added that there were more of the younger ones, and they might be lucky enough to avoid clashes in the mountains, but the older ones would do everything in their power to attack. Having said this, Freya left, and Rangus, terrified and covered in cold sweat, asked the others what they should do now. In addition to the poisonous creatures, they faced the threat of being hunted by the upperclassmen, who, as Leica noted grimly, were at least 1-star level. Leica admitted that she wouldn't stand a chance against a crowd, just like most of her classmates, and Sieg nodded, agreeing with her reasoning. He advised Leica to form a group of 2 or 3 people, since cooperation during the trial was not prohibited by the rules. A group would help with defense and hunting, but when Rangus asked, Sieg replied that he planned to go it alone and enjoy the exam. Rangus was shocked by such plans, and Leica sighed, admitting that it was quite like him, after which Sieg suggested they grab a bite to eat before starting their intense training. On the way, Leica asked Rangus if he ever thought Sieg was strange, to which he merely shrugged and agreed uncertainly. 5 days later, the students gathered at the foot of the mountain, filled with both fear and determination. Rangus stood next to Leica, holding a spear and trembling with fear. The trial was about to begin. The other students were also filled with anticipation, and Freya, with a confident smile, announced that the weather was perfect for the start. Nervous about the start of the exam, Rangus moved closer to his partner and asked whether, following Sieg's plan, he should really be on Lady Leica's team. He thought she might choose distinguished students instead of a commoner without stars, but another student approached and assured him that they were in the same boat. Turning around, Rangus recognized Raymond and Selena. Selena admitted that she too was a commoner and didn't believe she'd been invited to join Lady Leica's team. Raymond simply smiled, looking at Lady Leica. They were from the eastern wing of the Dragon's Nest, but Leica was quick to declare that the origins of her teammates were of no consequence. She chose them for their potential. Upon hearing this, Rangus fell silent and then gripped his spear tightly and promised to do everything in his power not to be a burden. Raymond also promised to give it his all to live up to her expectations, to which Leica replied with a smile that she was counting on them. Then she turned to Sieg and asked if he would really go alone, to which he nodded confidently, eagerly awaiting the moment. A nervous Selena admitted she admired them both, because while she was trembling with fear, Sieg was ready to face the grief alone. Raymond considered their confidence natural given their family lineage, but Leica asked him not to compare her to Sieg, admitting she was nervous. Sieg was very surprised and asked if she had any reason to worry at all, noting that besides her, a group of promising students had gathered here. However, they all replied that there were plenty of reasons to be nervous, after which Leica asked if Sieg considered the students she had chosen to be skilled. Sieg immediately confirmed this, thinking to himself that Leica's eye for talent was truly outstanding, since she had gathered the best. He praised their offense and defense, predicting an easy test for them, which they were forced to reluctantly agree to. With a bead of sweat, Rangus noted Sieg's excessive self-confidence, while Freya, in the meantime, checked attendance and noticed the formed groups. Since not everyone had managed to master the martial arts, teams were a good idea, and Freya announced that the trial would begin shortly. She explained the task once more: to survive a month on Poison Dragon Mountain and keep their crystal orbs completely intact for submission. Each orb was identical, which meant it was possible to steal someone else's if you lost your own, and this statement caused great alarm among the students. They understood what it meant. While Sieg realized that stealing spheres from other participants was considered fair game, if you lose one, take another. Freya added that the upperclassmen would follow the freshmen up the mountain. The upperclassmen's taunts about how easy it was to take balls from freshmen without stars immediately reached the ears of the students, and quickly filled Sieg's classmates with a mixture of wild fear, excitement, and anxiety. And so, as soon as Freya finished her explanations and announced the start of the trial, the students rushed toward the mountain in a huge column. Who would be the fastest? And Sieg heard Leica tell him he absolutely had to survive. Smiling, he promised to do so and wished them the same. After which, on the run, Leica called the team together and told them to stick together. And Sieg, after asking them to be careful, caught Freya's attention. Freya told Sieg that it was his turn to go in, and he agreed, politely apologizing for getting a little carried away. Freya asked in puzzlement if he had really gotten carried away by what was happening, and if he wasn't feeling the usual nervousness before the exam. She asked if he wasn't nervous at all, to which Sieg replied in the negative with a serene and calm smile, and headed toward the mountain. Freya watched him go, considering him a rather peculiar young man. And that night at camp, one of the instructors asked her about the fate of the new recruits. The instructors expressed concern about the early start of the trial for the new recruits. They had no stars and no real combat experience, having trained for only a couple of months. They wondered how many of them would survive, but Freya was quick to reassure them, confidently stating that there was no cause for concern. Despite the 1- or 2-star venomous creatures, they posed no serious threat, and Freya assured them with a smile that the students would manage. The instructors understood and apologized. Then she whispered quietly that she would eventually release that very creature. But when the instructor asked what she had said, the girl simply replied with a smile that she hadn't said anything. She announced the start of the trial for the upperclassmen, who immediately rushed toward the mountain, clutching their weapons with eyes shining with joy. Watching them leave, Freya muttered to herself, wondering how many would survive, and admitted she was burning with impatience to see the final results. Meanwhile, in the mountains, the upperclassmen who had begun their hunt spotted their first target, standing motionless at the foot of Sieg. One of them mockingly noted that the newbies had long since gone inside, and gripping his weapon tightly, wondered if this lone guy was stupid. Another girl raised her crossbow and prepared to fire. As soon as she pulled the trigger, the arrowhead flashed in the air, which was aimed straight at the protagonist's eye. But Sieg effortlessly caught the arrow fired at him right in midair. While the upperclassmen stared at him in shock, Sieg snapped the arrow in half and told them he'd been waiting for them. And when one of them didn't understand, another shouted that it didn't matter. Reminded of the masterfully caught arrow, the seniors tensed up, and Sieg, without wasting a second, rushed forward with eyes burning with excitement. With a smirk on his face, he suggested they play a little game together. Deep within Poison Dragon Mountain, Selena and her group were subjected to a fierce attack by the local bloodthirsty monsters. After Selena defeated a massive toad-like creature, another one suddenly leaped at her from behind. Raymond swiftly raised his shield, blocking the unexpected attack, and saving Selena from an inevitable blow just in time. With a powerful swing, he slammed the monster into the ground and drove his shield straight into its body, instantly killing the hideous creature on the spot. Seeing that Rangus had also easily defeated his own opponent, Raymond merely smiled with satisfaction. Then Lika praised the guys for their excellent teamwork, for which Rangus expressed his most sincere gratitude to her. However, his eyes widened in shock when he saw a whole mountain of slain frog-like monsters that Lika had defeated single-handedly. Impressed, Selena noted that Lika's strength was indeed on a completely different level, just as they had expected. Raymond agreed, adding that while they had been busy fighting a couple of monsters, Lika had already managed to destroy most of them. Lika merely shrugged, replying that for a 2-star warrior, these creatures were nothing more than a light warm-up. She also noted that since the exam began a week ago, everyone had noticeably increased in power, especially Selena and Raymond, who had reached 1 star. Selena gratefully acknowledged that without Lika's guidance, they wouldn't have progressed so quickly, and Raymond agreed with her. Rangus, however, remained silent, sadly realizing just how far behind he had fallen now that his comrades had earned their 1st stars. Noticing his dejected state, Selena gently encouraged him, assuring him that in time he would surely grow stronger and reach that level as well. Raymond advised his friend to be patient and simply keep training hard. Hearing their words of support, Rangus smiled again and sincerely thanked both friends for believing in him. Then Lika added that Rangus had managed to defeat 3 giant toad monsters even without a star, which was impressive in itself. She emphasized that after his private training sessions with Sieg, he had perfected his spearmanship, so earning a star was only a matter of time. Touched by her unwavering faith in his abilities, Rangus nearly shed a tear from the overwhelming emotions. Glancing at the sky, Lika noticed night falling rapidly and ordered the group to return to base immediately. Selena agreed with her, warning that once darkness fell, Poison Dragon Mountain became too dangerous. But on the way back, Lika suddenly froze in her tracks. Rangus immediately asked what was wrong, but the girl completely ignored his concerned question. Her face darkened, and staring ahead, she sternly asked what a certain student had forgotten so close to their camp. A moment later, a figure emerged from the tall grass. Rangus and the others flinched in surprise, while Selena and Raymond instinctively grabbed their weapons. The student emerged with a smirk, holding his weapon casually, and admitted that he hadn't expected to be spotted so quickly. Lika immediately recognized him as one of the upperclassmen and asked point-blank if he had come here for their crystal. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, she realized that they had finally been attacked by an upperclassman, and a 2-star one at that. The guy smirked, explaining that the point of the exam was to steal crystals from the freshmen, though he hadn't expected Lady Lika's group to be his target. Lika asked if he planned to stay even after realizing whose base he had dared to invade. She warned that a single upperclassman wouldn't stand a chance against her team, but he just grinned menacingly, asking who exactly said he was here alone. 3 more upperclassmen emerged from the grass behind him, each possessing 1-star level strength. Their leader gloated that even Lika would have a hard time dealing with them, considering that her companions were nothing but pathetic dead weight. Drawing his sword, he loudly ordered the entire team of little girls to surrender and voluntarily hand over their crystal spheres. Then he lunged at Lika with his incredibly powerful attack, but she easily dodged it, ordering the others to hold their ground, while Selena was already fighting one of the upperclassmen, and Lika told them to hold their ground while she dealt with the leader. Raymond immediately pulled out his shield. Meanwhile, Rangus, still without a star, was trying his hardest to defend himself against his opponent's furious attacks. The upperclassman taunted him, advising him to just give up and hand over his crystal without any pointless resistance. Rangus hesitated, unsure of what to do, until he suddenly remembered a conversation he'd had with Sieg long ago. Back then, Rangus had asked Sieg if there was any way for a weak fighter like him to defeat stronger enemies. He admitted that he didn't have a star, and feared that when strong enemies appeared, he would only drag his team down. Sieg's answer shocked him at the time, because Sieg, in all seriousness, advised him to simply give up. Sieg explained that against a 3- or 4-star opponent, surrender was the only logical option for someone without a star. However, he added that if Rangus faced a 1-star opponent, he would still have a real chance of winning. When Rangus asked in bewilderment how, Sieg calmly replied that he simply needed to find and skillfully exploit a gap in the enemy's defense. Confused, Rangus then asked what kind of gap he was talking about. Sieg confirmed that if you find a vulnerability in your opponent's defense, you can defeat them, even if they have a 2-star rank. When Rangus asked how to find this weakness, Sieg gave extremely simple and clear advice. All one had to do was be patient and wait until the overconfident opponent revealed that very gap himself. Rangus was very skeptical at the time, But Sieg simply continued his methodical explanations. He claimed that against a strong enemy, a weakness cannot be created. One can only wait for their inevitable and fatal mistake. If a fighter is incapable of even that, then victory over a stronger opponent will forever remain nothing more than a pipe dream for him. Sieg added that he wouldn't last long against exceptional geniuses like Lika, but against an ordinary two-star fighter, he should have every chance of success. Then he told Rengis that competence in one's own abilities is critically important and gave him one last piece of valuable advice. He shouldn't have worried too much about creating a breach or the enormous difference in power between them. He just had to wait patiently, and when the chance arose, without the slightest hesitation, drive his spear straight into the target. And now, in the heat of battle, Rengis clenched his fists tightly as Sieg's wise words echoed in his mind. Being the weaker one, he had no choice but to endure every blow and simply wait calmly for the right moment. The moment when this dim-witted fool would let his guard down and Rengis could strike. The upperclassman grew increasingly irritated that Rengis continued to withstand his blows with such resilience. In a rage, he shouted at the freshman to finally fall, landing another crushing blow. But it was at that very moment that Rengis saw the very opening that Sieg had spoken to him about so confidently. It literally flashed before his eyes. Without the slightest hesitation, he gathered all his strength and thrust his spear straight into the exposed body of his stunned opponent. The senior gasped and collapsed to the ground, instantly losing consciousness from the wound. As he fell to the ground unconscious, a bright light flashed on Rengis's chest, the sign of his first star, which had just awakened. Lika noticed this immediately, feeling both surprise and pride that Rengis had been able to defeat the enemy on his own. Meanwhile, the senior class leader was in shock, unable to understand why Lika's power seemed so overwhelming despite their equal ranks. Lika realized that after mastering the axe technique recommended by Sieg, she had learned to channel more energy into her two-handed sword. She coldly informed her opponent that choosing her group as a target had been his greatest and most fatal mistake. Summoning a powerful golden lightning bolt around her sword, she confidently declared that this battle had reached its logical conclusion. Her blade delivered a blinding strike, and the enemy leader collapsed lifelessly to the ground, unconscious. After making sure all the enemies were defeated, Lika rushed to her team to check if everyone was okay. Upon receiving confirmation, the entire group breathed a joyful sigh of immense relief. They had just won their first significant victory over experienced upperclassmen. Selena and Raymond congratulated Rengis on earning his first star, to which he responded with his brightest smile. Lika looked at the team with pride, realizing that now absolutely all of its members had awakened their first stars. Having said that, she added confidently that all their future battles would be much easier. Then, with a pensive expression, she wondered aloud how Sieg was doing right now. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Poison Dragon Mountains, a terrified senior was running for his life. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded incessantly for whoever the hell it was not to come near him under any circumstances. Trembling with primal fear, he cursed under his breath and asked himself what kind of monster this boy named Sieg really was. A few moments later, the upperclassman ran off in a panic, calling for help and sincerely hoping that Sieg wouldn't follow them. At the same time, Sieg calmly dragged one of the upperclassmen he had just defeated behind him. The rest, in fear and confusion, hurled curses, wondering what kind of mad monster or demon this was. Holding the corpse of a giant serpentine beast in one hand, Sieg asked mockingly what their problem was and why no one wanted to play with him anymore. The utterly terrified upperclassmen called him a psychopath and wondered why a freshman like Sieg was hunting them, since it was supposed to be exactly the opposite. They were supposed to be the cold-blooded hunters, not the prey cornered into a corner. Suddenly, one of the fleeing guys tripped and fell to the ground with a thud. As he tried to get back on his feet, he literally froze in the face of the chilling terror that washed over him. Sieg was already standing right in front of him, blocking his path to retreat. His crimson eyes glinting slightly, Sieg sighed heavily and admitted that he was already growing tired of this endless chase. He held out his hand, offering the boy help, but calmly added that they would still have to fight after that. The senior's eyes widened in sheer terror, after which his body went limp, and he collapsed, unconscious, to the ground. Sieg tilted his head in confusion, muttering to himself as he tried to figure out what had just happened to this guy. Looking around, he asked aloud what was going on with the upperclassmen and why they had become so cowardly. He mocked how aggressive they had been during their first encounter, only to end up running away in fear. At that very moment, Sieg suddenly sensed someone's faint but distinct presence nearby. Turning in that direction, he invited the observer to come closer if they wanted to get a better look at what was happening. Receiving no reply, Sieg smirked, deciding that since they were simply watching him without interfering, he must not be doing anything wrong. Having reached this conclusion, he declared that he would stop holding back and would gladly continue his little game with the students. From the direction where Sieg had sensed a stranger's presence, an adult man slowly emerged. He was one of the official proctors tasked with closely monitoring the exam. Beads of sweat rolled down his cheeks as he tried to figure out who this kid was. He had personally witnessed Sieg effortlessly defeating upperclassmen who, by all logic, should have been far stronger than him. But even more striking was that the boy had been able to easily detect his carefully concealed presence. Realizing the gravity of what he had witnessed, the supervisor made a firm decision to report everything to the leadership immediately. Meanwhile, at the camp outside Mount Freya, they were caught off guard when several observers arrived with a report. According to their official data, exactly 1 week had passed since the official start of their survival exam. At this point, about 30% of all freshmen had already dropped out and withdrawn from the trial. The remaining students had gradually adapted to the harsh environment and dangers of the mountain, so no further mass dropouts were expected. However, when Freya asked about the condition of the upperclassmen, the observers exchanged anxious glances and hesitated. Finally, one of them reluctantly admitted that the upperclassmen were currently on the run. Freya frowned, pausing to think for a moment, and asked why they were running and what exactly they were trying to escape. She pointed out that there were no monsters on the mountain capable of threatening the upperclassmen. Then one of the observers explained in a trembling voice that they weren't running from some wild monster at all. They were fleeing in panic from Lord Sieg. Freya raised an eyebrow in surprise, not understanding. The observer took a deep breath and explained that Sieg had ruthlessly attacked and systematically hunted down the upperclassmen. At first, they tried to fight back, but in the end, they had no choice but to flee. Another observer interjected, asking what kind of person this Lord Sieg was, since he clearly enjoyed this bloody hunt. Based on his observations, it was a game to Sieg, and such behavior seemed completely unprecedented to them. The second observer nodded, agreeing that even though Sieg was the son of the family head, he could by no means be called normal. To them, he was no longer just a young genius, but had turned into something frightening, a true monster in human form. Freya listened to them in silence, then admitted that from the very beginning she had suspected there was something strange about Sieg that set him apart from the other students. Unlike the others, he had decided to take the exam alone and seemed completely relaxed as he entered the mountain's grounds. And that could mean only one thing. Sieg hadn't even planned to hide from the attacking upperclassmen in the first place. From the very beginning, his goal had been to hunt them down. And, recalling Sieg's gaze, Freya couldn't help but admit that he was a monster. Suddenly, one of the observers frowned, wondering what that strange noise nearby was. A faint smile appeared on Freya's lips, and she replied that the sound was exactly what she had been waiting for. Then a man approached and asked Lady Freya where they should place the massive cage they had just brought in. When the observers turned to look at the cage, their eyes widened in shock at the sight before them. They immediately asked what kind of creature was inside and whether Freya really intended to release a 3-star level beast onto the mountain. After all, such a monster was far too powerful, and none of the students present there would be able to handle it. But a clearly pleased Freya reassured them, stating that there was absolutely no reason to panic. She explained that the creature had already undergone the necessary adjustments and would only attack those who had reached the 2-star level or higher. Ordinary students were safe. Then one of the observers asked why it was necessary to release such a monster in the middle of the exam. Freya calmly replied that it was a direct order from Balza himself, the acting head of their family. Deep down, she herself wanted to see the true abilities of the boy whom their soldiers had already begun to call a monster. She was eager to find out if Sieg could survive a clash with such a powerful and dangerous creature. With that in mind, she gave a strict order to release the mysterious beast onto Poison Dragon Mountain at dawn. The next morning, deep in the mountains, Rangus and his team came to an abrupt halt as the ground beneath them shook violently. Lika frowned, admitting that this sudden tremor gave her a very bad feeling. Raymond suggested that perhaps it was the work of the upperclassmen who had set up yet another ambush. But Rangus shook his head, deciding that it was most likely a large beast, such as a massive boar of wrath. Despite this, Lika couldn't shake her unease, noting that this time, everything felt completely different. A moment later, a second, even more powerful earthquake shook the mountain, putting the team on high alert. And then, suddenly, a giant tree began to fall toward them. Lika's instincts instantly took over. She shouted for everyone to run, and the group barely managed to jump out of the way as the massive trunk crashed down on where they had been standing. Turning around, Lika literally froze in place, unable to believe her eyes or the scale of the looming threat. Selena gasped, asking what kind of creature it was, while Rangus's face turned pale and cold sweat rolled down his temples. In a trembling voice, he said they needed to run immediately because a colossal golem loomed right in front of them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountain, Sieg sat bored, and he sat on a mountain of corpses of defeated monsters and students, noting that the situation had become boring. Since no one else dared to challenge him, and the onlookers simply let him do whatever he wanted, Sieg was disappointed. But suddenly, he sensed someone's presence on the opposite side of the mountain, which made him wonder about the nature of that aura. At first, he decided it belonged to a 2-star creature, but soon realized it was a 3-star entity. He immediately wondered if monsters of such a high rank could truly exist on Poison Dragon Mountain. He also wondered if this aura belonged to some unknown being that had been dwelling here for 1,000 years. Sieg understood that all the examinees would surely be helpless against such a beast, and even Lika herself would not be able to handle it. He believed that the instructors should have made sure there were no such threats on the mountain before the trial began. But after a moment's thought, he wondered if Freya and the other instructors had deliberately allowed this monster to remain. He admitted to himself that he had not the slightest idea what exactly was going on in the minds of these examiners. Nevertheless, he considered this an ideal situation. For now, he once again had a worthy opponent to entertain himself with. And since he was eager to battle a 3-star monster, Sieg decided to go to it himself, declaring that the creature would have to wait for him. Meanwhile, Selena had already managed to launch her most powerful attack directly at the massive body of the stone golem. But even a blow delivered with all her strength had absolutely no effect on this colossal monster. She couldn't believe she hadn't managed to leave even a single, barely visible scratch on the golem's sturdy body. Raymond also rushed into battle and struck the golem with his shield with all his might, but his attack proved just as useless as Selena's. This forced Lika to unleash her aura and powerful bolts of lightning to deliver the next strike. Noticing that a scratch had appeared on the golem's arm, Lika concluded that her aura was indeed capable of damaging its outer shell. In other words, only 2-star fighters could deal damage to it, while her 1-star comrades were incapable of doing so. Rangus immediately turned to Lady Lika, asking with concern in his voice what their next steps would be in this situation. Lika ordered them in a stern tone not to do anything unnecessary. She explained that as soon as she drew the golem's attention to herself, they would have to seize the moment and flee. However, Rangus flatly refused, declaring that they would never leave Lady Lika to fight this monster alone. Lika replied that in battle they would only be a burden to her, and ordered them to look at the golem's scratched arm. She added that even with her aura, she'd only managed to leave a scratch, and for them, as 1-star fighters, this enemy was simply too much for them. Raymond admitted that they couldn't hurt the creature, but added that they were capable of supporting Lika so that her attacks would hit their mark. When Lika asked what they meant, Rangus firmly stated that he would do everything possible not to be a burden to her. Selena agreed, noting that if they helped Lika's attacks hit their mark, they would surely have a chance at a shared victory. Moved by her comrades' determination and boundless trust, Lika couldn't help but smile as she accepted their offer. She said she would rely entirely on their support so that her strikes would hit the monster's weak spots precisely. While Lika concentrated her aura and lightning into her sword, Raymond prepared to defend, and Rangus and Selena prepared to attack as a distraction. Having channeled all her power into her blade, Lika ordered them to launch a coordinated attack on the golem. She quickly stepped forward to face the monster head-on, but it instantly unleashed a heavy attack on her. Raymond shielded her, but because he was only a 1-star, it was incredibly difficult for him to withstand the enemy's 3-star power. Rangus and Selena rushed forward, striking the golem to draw its attention to themselves as much as possible. Meanwhile, Lika swiftly moved behind the golem to deliver her decisive and crushing blow. She used the thunderous two-handed sword technique, Heavenly Thunder, striking the golem from behind with all her might. A massive explosion shook the dense forest of Poison Dragon Mountain, leaving behind only clouds of dust and smoke. When Lika managed to knock the golem down and the smoke cleared, the colossal scale of the damage inflicted on the surroundings became evident. Rangus immediately ran over to check if she was okay, and Lika confirmed she was, though she admitted she had exhausted all her energy reserves. Then she asked anxiously how Raymond was feeling after taking such a heavy blow on his shield. Leaning on Selena, Raymond smiled weakly and replied that he was perfectly fine as well. But as soon as Lika suggested returning to base, she suddenly sensed the golem's presence right behind them again. She immediately shoved Rangus aside, causing the golem to grab her instead with its massive stone hand. Trapped in the monster's grip, she couldn't believe that after such a blow, the creature was still capable of moving. She bitterly realized that she had become too overconfident and had let her guard down after her seemingly successful attack. Selena was also shocked that the golem had survived Lika's full-force blow and still posed an active threat. Rangus immediately tried to save Lika by attacking the golem with his spear, but the golem began swinging the girl around, preventing him from landing a blow. As Rangus grew increasingly panicked for Lika's life, a whole tree suddenly flew toward them at tremendous speed. When the trunk crashed into the golem, it opened its hand in surprise, releasing Lika from its deadly grip. Rangus quickly helped her to her feet and ran to a safe distance from the enraged creature. Lika, still in a daze, wondered aloud what had happened and how she had managed to free herself. Then Sieg's voice suddenly interrupted their thoughts as he casually inquired about the situation they were facing. Rangus and Lika immediately recognized our protagonist as soon as they heard his familiar, calm tone. But instead of checking on Lika, Sieg was clearly too delighted and excited by the sight of this monster. With eyes burning with anticipation, he immediately asked what kind of amusing clay puppet was standing before him. A few moments before Sieg arrived on the scene, he caught a bright flash of a golden lightning aura. He immediately realized that this aura belonged to Lika, and was surprised that her group had been the first to encounter this terrifying monster. Rushing at full speed, Sieg noted that in his past life, he would have been at the source of that aura in a split second. But now all he could do was run toward the monster on his own 2 feet, which, in his current state, seemed simply pathetic to him. He also reflected on the fact that Lika's group consisted of very promising and talented young people. But their enemy was a 3-star monster, so he had no idea how long they would be able to hold out. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head, causing him to stop abruptly. He remembered a technique he had recently learned. He grabbed the trunk of a huge tree, yanked it out by the roots, and using his strength and the new technique, he hurled it straight at the monster. Watching the tree fly through the air, Sieg noted with satisfaction that the result of applying this new technique turned out to be quite good. He also decided that he hadn't been wrong to learn it, since with his current body, the art of the dragon's throw was essential. According to Sieg, the basic Eldragon combat manuals had been issued to him solely as preparation for the exam. The dragon-rearing martial arts contained only basic movements and texts on energy flows, but they suited him perfectly, especially considering that in his past life he had been a ranged fighter and now possessed a body suited for close quarters. However, he quickly realized that simply throwing a tree at the monster wouldn't be enough, so Sieg rushed back to the battlefield. Rangus, unable to believe his eyes, asked Sieg if it was really him, to which he confirmed, but noted that their main problem was the golem. Sieg's eyes flashed as he repeated the word, golem, noting with satisfaction that that was indeed what the creature was called. He also added that the creature was strange. He could sense its presence, but felt absolutely no life force within it. When the golem rose again, it immediately attacked Sieg, causing Lika to cry out and Rangus to warn of the extreme danger. But despite the golem's powerful attack, Sieg casually caught its fist with one hand, noting that the creature was indeed sturdy. Assessing the golem's toughness, Sieg quickly realized he would have to use his aura to gradually break through its sturdy defenses. Pushing the monster's fist away, he noted that defeating this golem with ordinary, mundane methods would be far too boring. An irritated Lika sighed and scolded Sieg for behaving, as always, too recklessly. And Rangus couldn't believe that Sieg found this fight boring, since their group had just barely escaped death at the hands of this monster. When the golem prepared to attack again, Sieg instantly realized that due to its imposing size, the creature was extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, he blocked the blow to his forehead without hesitation, which led to a powerful collision that shook the entire surrounding area. As he parried the blow, Sieg ordered the others to retreat immediately, as staying nearby was too dangerous for their lives. Lika's group obeyed Sieg's order without question and hurriedly left the area of this devastating battlefield. After making sure they had retreated to a safe distance, Sieg gathered his strength and, with incredible power, hurled the golem aside. As the creature flew away with a crash, he noted with satisfaction that its outer shell was indeed incredibly durable. Concentrating his aura in his fist and lunging forward, Sieg admitted that he wanted to find out if the golem's insides were as strong as its shell. Leaping high into the air, he confidently declared that the perfect time had come to test the strength of its insides. Then he activated the first form of the dragon destruction martial art, Explosive World, striking the monster and causing a massive explosion. In Sieg's opinion, rather than spending a long time breaking through the armor, It was better to use this technique to destroy the golem from the inside out. Satisfied that his plan and attack had gone off without a hitch, Sieg was thrilled, noting that this style of fighting was much more fun, and the scene shifted to the forest landscape where this trial took place. Meanwhile, a month later, in the main building of Eldragon State, an irritated Sieg was demanding to know why he had been pulled away from his training. He was told that the month-long exam on Poison Dragon Mountain had officially and successfully concluded. It turned out that after the attack by the 3-star golem, there had been no further serious incidents involving the students. The number of 7-year-old students had dropped to 30% due to the harsh and unforgiving conditions of Poison Dragon Mountain. But thanks to the constant danger, the remaining students achieved good results and confidently reached the 1-star level. Immediately after the exam ended, Sieg was personally summoned by Gilfas Eldragon, the current head of their powerful family. As they walked down one of the corridors of the main estate, Sieg asked Freya what exactly the head wanted from him. Freya was displeased that Sieg referred to him simply as head, and asked him to address him as Master Head. However, Sieg merely waved her off. Freya understood perfectly well the reason for the summons, but she still explained to Sieg that he had brought this upon himself with his behavior during the exam. When Sieg asked if it really was because of his behavior, Freya immediately and emphatically confirmed his guess. She explained that the point of the exam for the upperclassmen was to steal crystals from the underclassmen, but Sieg had done exactly the opposite. Freya added that because of him, no one had been able to steal a single crystal, and now the upperclassmen would have to retake the exam. Sieg objected that the rules didn't forbid attacking the upperclassmen, but Freya replied that no one had simply expected such audacity. She just sighed heavily and, turning away, declared that he should correct his terrible attitude before meeting with the headmaster. Freya reminded Sieg once again to watch his behavior and tone in the head's presence, especially when addressing him directly. However, Sieg merely asked why, to which Freya replied that, although he was still young, his terrible temper could very well lead him to his grave. She added that she would absolutely hate to witness his own father executing him simply because of his manners. Sieg merely remarked that if that were the case, Gilfas was, by all accounts, a very cruel man. Upon reaching the door, Freya immediately knocked, and addressing Gilfas as the head, introduced herself as a member of the Black Dragon Corps, stating that they had come at his summons and saluted him. Gilfas permitted them to enter in a serious tone, and they went in first. As soon as Freya opened the door and they entered the room, he noticed the space around him, and while he was surveying the hall, his companion reported from the doorway that she had brought Sieg as ordered by the head. Gilfas, without looking up from his letter, suddenly raised his stern gaze to Sieg, his bastard son, and asked in all seriousness why he had attacked the upperclassmen during the exam. Sieg fell silent for a moment, then replied that everyone kept asking him the same questions. So instead of answering, he decided to ask his father, was he forbidden from attacking the upperclassmen during the exam? When Gilfas asked what he meant, Sieg stated that to pass, one had to survive a month on Poison Dragon Mountain and preserve the crystal spheres. With no other rules, he was free to use his time as he pleased. He added that if there were any prohibited actions during the exam, they should have been clearly stated before the test began. Hearing Sieg's words, Freya felt intense fear and anxiety. She immediately raised her voice, demanding an explanation of what he was talking about and why he dared to speak that way in the head's presence. At that moment, Gilfas' eyes narrowed at the protagonist's words, and he unleashed his terrifying dragon aura, which quickly filled the entire room. Under the pressure of it, Freya collapsed to her knees, thinking that the head's power was so great that it could kill Sieg. However, contrary to her expectations, the protagonist remained standing, and Gilfas' pressure had no effect on him. Moreover, Sieg even advised Gilfas to stop trying to intimidate him, as it was starting to get incredibly annoying, causing Gilfas' face to darken with a mixture of shock and anger. While Freya was still on her knees, Sieg asked if Gilfas had really summoned him just to ask such pointless questions. Then Gilfas asked how Sieg had managed to do it, but the boy didn't understand the point of the question and asked for clarification. Gilfas explained that according to reports, Sieg had not only defeated the upperclassmen, but also taken down a 3-star golem, and asked how he managed to stand so calmly before him after he had unleashed such colossal pressure upon him. Then, in all seriousness, he demanded an answer as to how someone like Sieg, merely a bastard child, could have acquired such unfathomable strength and power. Sieg merely asked if Gilfas really wanted to know the reason for his strength, and replied that it was very simple. The only reason was that he was Sieg. This caused Balza to frown in disappointment, while Sieg's gaze sharpened, showing that he stood firm on his defiant answer. After a moment of silent exchange of glances, Balza finally said that Sieg's character was indeed as terrible as the reports claimed, but he would still reward him for defeating the golem. Balza said he could choose whatever he wished. The choice of a reward from the dragon's treasury or the hall astonished Freya. She didn't understand Balza's motives, for the rarest artifacts of Eldragon had been kept there for 1,000 years. She knew that the Dragon Hall housed all manner of books, including those containing now forbidden techniques, while the Dragon Treasury held relics of previous heads of the Eldragon family, including legendary weapons, spiritual medicines, artifacts, and other items from various eras. The Eldragon vaults were strictly guarded. Access to the rare treasures of the Dragon Hall and beyond was granted only to a select few for exceptionally outstanding achievements. Freya was struck by the fact that Balza had deemed the audacious Sieg to be outstanding. Sieg himself demanded that they not be stingy and let him into both the Dragon Hall and the treasury at the same time. However, Balza cut him off, saying he could choose only one, and then ordered them to leave. But Sieg suddenly pointed a finger at him, unable to believe their conversation was already over, and declared that he still had much to say. This angered Freya. She immediately grabbed Sieg by the collar and, dragging him away, she cheerfully remarked that it had been a tremendous honor for him to receive the award personally from the head's hands, adding that she understood the order and they were leaving immediately. As she turned away and dragged Sieg behind her, he shouted that in that case, he wanted to tell Balza just one last thing. As long as Balza continued to suppress his own emotions like this, he would never become stronger, no matter what he did. Balza was stunned and released his aura once more, only to discover that his dragon aura had been suppressed by the protagonist's divine dragon. A trembling Freya ordered Sieg to be quiet, and when they left Balza's room, the protagonist's father remained seated in silence, wondering what kind of essence he had just sensed in Sieg. Meanwhile, after leaving the main hall, Freya shouted, asking what on earth Sieg had been thinking and why he had behaved so rudely toward the head, and also asked if he had really ignored all her warnings before they entered Balza's room. Sieg simply asked what she was talking about, noting that he had done his best to restrain himself and behave appropriately in front of Balza. This made Freya indignant. Freya wondered why Sieg was polite to her, but rude to the head. Sieg answered simply, Balza was his father, which was why his manner of speaking to him was completely different. Given Sieg's abilities and personality, Freya could only admit that he really wasn't an ordinary child and ask who he really was. However, Sieg asked in response if she was serious about the question, and as always, replied that he was Sieg, which left Freya speechless. To herself, she reasoned that they had all drunk the blood of ancient dragons in infancy and had not the slightest chance of challenging the head, since Balza possessed the power of the Dragon King, the highest of his kind. And even Sieg shouldn't have been able to stand up to him. That was precisely why she couldn't understand who this boy really was, capable of standing so calmly before the head. When Freya fell silent, Sieg asked if there was a problem, but she shook her head, thinking to herself that she needed to carefully examine the records of his birth. Then she asked what reward he would choose, explaining once more that he could either enter the Dragon Hall up to the 2nd floor or take any item from the Dragon Treasury, but he could only choose one. When Sieg asked again if he could have both, Freya refused, so he had no choice but to choose the Dragon Hall for the sake of knowledge. Sieg realized how little he knew about the present era. He longed to study the new medicines and tools of recent centuries, but was forced to choose just one. At that moment, Rangus appeared, unable to believe that they would actually be allowed into the Eldragon family's Dragon Hall. When Sieg asked if he was happy, Rangus immediately confirmed it and said that the Strike Dragon martial arts and Nurturing Dragon spear techniques he had already learned were amazing, and now he had the chance to master even more advanced techniques from the Dragon Hall, adding that he couldn't believe he was receiving such a generous reward for passing the exam. Soon, Laika approached, worried. How much knowledge would she be able to absorb? Sieg learned that even on the 1st floor of the Dragon Hall, there were strict time limits. She explained that each of them was allowed to take one book out, but inside they could read as many books as they wanted until their time was up. So managing their time wisely inside was of the utmost importance. Sieg simply replied that he understood everything. Laika then mentioned that she'd heard rumors that Sieg had been given a choice of rewards and asked why he'd chosen the Dragon Hall over the Dragon's Treasury, noting that, based on what she knew about him, he should have chosen the treasury. Sieg replied that he had thought about that at first, But at the moment, knowledge was far more valuable to him. Hearing this, Laika noted that the second floor of the Dragon Hall housed far rarer manuscripts, even rarer than those on the first floor, especially regarding martial arts. And that, according to rumors, the difference in their quality was simply colossal. Nevertheless, she added that she sincerely believed there was no technique better than her own technique of the thunderous two-handed sword. Sieg, however, simply stared intently at the Dragon Hall, which made Laika ask if he was even listening to her. When they finally reached the Dragon Hall, the Guardian announced that their time limit inside would be 5 hours, and reminded them to use their time wisely and keep quiet. Sieg didn't know if 5 hours was a lot, but Laika explained that it was generous, since other students were usually given no more than 2 or 3 hours to visit. She added that their first priority was to choose a book to take out, and then spend the rest of the time reading as many other volumes as possible. Rangus knew about geniuses who read books by the stack, but he himself only hoped to find the right martial arts manual before the deadline. When they entered the Dragon Hall, Sieg noted that finding the right books to take out would likely be difficult, while Rangus and Selena still couldn't believe they were actually inside, and that the place looked exactly like this. Sieg, however, noted that the number of books in the Dragon Hall was even more impressive than he had expected. He immediately smiled in anticipation of whether he might find some new knowledge here that would surprise him. The protagonist stood before the enormous bookshelves and was now getting ready to start searching in earnest. In those moments, when our protagonist had finished selecting and reading some of the books that interested him, he looked as if he had been struck by lightning from the shock. He wondered what new information he had just discovered. Surrounded by mountains of books in front of and on either side of him, Sieg still couldn't believe what he had read about rifts, chaos, and magic. Due to the overwhelming amount of new knowledge, his mind struggled to process it all at once. In the end, Sieg simply lay down next to the books he had already read, saying that the events of the last 1,000 years had been terrifying, and, most importantly, he still couldn't believe what had happened to their world in just a single millennium. Especially the fact that their world was now connected to another world through rifts. According to the data he had found, 900 years ago, the spatial barrier had first ruptured following the appearance of a rift. Beyond that rift lay a chaotic world, now known as the Realm of Chaos. Monsters known as Chaos roamed freely in the Realm of Chaos, and it was also home to people who possessed a powerful energy of the Source and continued to fight this scourge. Upon learning of these people's existence, the Eldragon family joined forces with them. Warriors from the otherworldly realm of Typhon, Fafnir, Leviathan, and Bahamut joined Eldragon. They founded the 4 great branches of the family that still rule today. Sieg recalled Angerbor in the Black Mist and Laika's lightning-fast aura. That beast slain in the forest and the girl's recent display of power gave him pause. He admitted to himself that he knew absolutely nothing about all these things, for both the Black Mist of Angerbor and Laika's thunderous aura originated from that other world. But what truly captured his interest was magic. To Sieg, it seemed like cutting-edge technology that people from another world had brought into their own. His eyes sparkled with delight as he wondered where the books on magic might be, and asked himself why he couldn't find a single guide that would teach him this art. In theory, such work should have been located near the history section. But then Sieg startled, suddenly hearing a voice commanding him to be quiet inside the Dragon Hall. Turning around, he noticed a golden aura in a darker part of the hall, and immediately wondered how he could have heard the voice if he hadn't sensed anyone's presence. Could it have been magic transmitting sound again? Looking up at the ceiling of the Dragon Hall, Sieg confirmed that he still sensed no one's presence except for the energy source he had noticed earlier. Then suddenly the books in front of him began to move. When the volumes soared into the air, Sieg was completely shocked and cried out in surprise, asking what was happening. But his eyes lit up again immediately when he realized one thing. It was the use of threads of source energy to manipulate objects and books. But when the mysterious voice ordered him to be silent again, Sieg snatched one of the books right out of the air, asking how he could remain silent at the sight of something so astonishing, and demanded that the source of the voice show itself to him properly. However, the cloaked figure sitting on the upper floor of the Dragon Hall ignored him and remained silent. Using his threads of source energy once more, the stranger caused Sieg to freeze instantly. The boy realized that his entire body was now bound. The next moment, the mysterious figure in the cloak hurled him down to the first floor, declaring that his time in the Dragon Hall had expired. Flying out the hall's doors, Sieg tumbled headlong across the ground, but managed to break his fall and land safely, remarking that he had discovered yet another thing he couldn't understand. Sieg, excited by the discovery, demanded that the cloaked figure show him the threads of energy. but he was interrupted by Rengis, who was confused and wanted to know what had happened. Laika appeared and asked why Zik had been thrown out of the hall. He brushed it off, saying he'd gotten carried away, and asked if they'd found the books and techniques they were looking for. Rengis confirmed this and said he'd taken a martial arts book titled The Art of the Spear of Cloud Water, adding that he seemed to have already learned a few simple techniques while inside. Selena reported that she had also mastered a few moves, and on top of that, she had taken the book The Art of the Windflower Sword with her. Reynolds said he had been studying the art of the Guardian Sword in the Eldragon style inside, and the book he had taken also belonged to the Eldragon style, namely, The Art of the Guardian's Shield. Zeke awkwardly congratulated them on their success, thinking to himself that all the techniques they had borrowed were ones he himself had created in his past life, simply for fun. When Zik asked which book Laika had chosen, she happily replied that she had taken The Art of the Heavy Wave Two-Handed Sword, created by the first patriarch of the Eldragon family, Gilfas Eldragon. This is an improved version of The Art of the Heavy Wave Two-Handed Sword from the 15th chapter. Laika added that she would study the book, drawing on her ancestral skills. Zik fell silent, pondering how yet another of his techniques had been reworked by the family's 15th head, just like his dragon's breath and the martial arts of the striking dragon. He also recalled seeing many books in the Dragon Hall related to his other techniques from the past, but now their improved versions stood alongside the originals. He wondered if the 15th head of the family was behind all these improved versions, finding this man increasingly intriguing. When Zik glanced at the Dragon Hall again, he thought that he had originally assumed it would be boring inside, but now he couldn't wait for the next chance to return there. The scene suddenly shifted to 5 years later, and as she walked down the hallway, Laika suddenly stopped, wondering where Zik and Rengis had gone. Just then, their classmates approached, and after greeting Lady Laika, told her that Lord Zik and the others were currently training at the training ground. She wondered with annoyance if this was happening again. Laika Typhon muttered, then thanked her classmates. She was already 12 years old. Soon after arriving at the training ground, she immediately saw Rengis, Reynolds, and Selena. They were all in fighting stances and preparing to attack our main character Zik, who was now 12 as well. Meanwhile, in his office, Balza sat and studying the report he had received about the appearance of a peculiar fault line. When he asked the person on the other end of the line whether this information was indeed reliable, the other party immediately confirmed it. The report came from Ain, captain of the Black Dragon Corps, who stated that, according to their investigation, the probability of magical water being present inside this fissure was approximately 80%. Balza was alarmed. The peculiar fissure had appeared in the most problematic area of their lands, but it could not be ignored. The chance of finding magical water there was too high. According to Balza, anyone who drank magical water became a mage, as they acquired a special physical constitution that allowed them to transform the source's energy into a different force known as mana. He also explained that the emergence of mana-based magic brought entirely new techniques to the world, and simultaneously sparked a fierce struggle for territories containing sources of magical water, known as magical springs. In this age of magic, the number of mages directly determined the military might of any house. However, there was not a single magical spring on the Eldragon family's territory. For a house like the Eldragon family, which had no springs of its own, there was only one way to obtain magical water: conquering special fault lines. The Eldragon family has few mages, and all of them are veterans of the rifts. Other houses are numerically stronger because of their springs, so capturing special rifts is the family's top priority. However, as Ain reported, the Forest of the Abundant Dragon, where the special fault had appeared, was far too problematic a place. Just a few days ago, there had even been a minor border skirmish in that region. The Forest of the Abundant Dragon was a vast forest, most of which lay within the territory of Eldragon, but part of it extended into the lands of another house. The family that claimed broader rights to this forest and called it the Great Abundant Forest was the Cerberus family. Ain added that the fault line itself was undoubtedly located on Eldragon's lands, but given its scale and location, the special area that had formed around it could very well extend into Cerberus territory. Knowing those mongrels, there was a high probability that they would flock there. Balza noted that their sense of smell was the only thing they were good for, and in any case, sooner or later they would have discovered the special rift. Thus, the Eldragon family had to prepare for an inevitable clash with them. Since it was a special rift, both sides' options were limited, but they needed to act before the Cerberus family figured everything out. Having made his decision, Balza immediately ordered Aina to notify all the dragon nests and announced that the qualifying exam would take place as soon as possible. Meanwhile, at the training ground, Laika noted that Rangus and the others really gave it their all every time they trained with Sieg. Right in the thick of the battle, Sieg remained completely calm, waiting for their attacks. When all three attacked Sieg simultaneously from different sides, the hero's face darkened. He braced his body and took all their blows at once. He blocked them with his bare hands. As the sharp tip of Rangus's spear dug forcefully into the hero's cheek, Sieg noticed that their coordination was good, but Rangus was putting too much force into the spear, which undermined the true power of the art of wielding this weapon. Almost all of them were already 12 years old. As for Selena, Sieg advised her not to fixate on speed and the number of strikes, since her attacks lacked weight and she needed to find the right balance. Sieg told Reynold that his movements and shield handling were good and correct, and yet Sieg noted that they were all still too passive and told them to get more used to attacking. He ordered them to attack him again. When Rangus charged forward once more, Laika realized that watching their training was still utter madness. When Sieg asked what exactly she found so crazy, Laika replied that letting them beat her bare body without using source energy was pure madness. Sieg just asked in confusion what she was talking about and declared that for him, this was real training. Shouting this at Laika and tensing the muscles under his shirt, he ordered her to witness the fruits of his training. Sieg added that thanks to such training, his body had become strong almost without the source's energy. Laika was indignant that Sieg should have at least ordered them to stop their attacks while they were talking. Rangus stabbed Sieg in the back with his spear to demonstrate the strength of his body to Laika. She simply clutched her head, muttering that everyone around her was crazy and engaged in dangerous delusions. Reynolds suddenly asked how Sieg could possess such incredible protection without using the source's energy, and Selena added that it was too mysterious to explain simply by the capabilities of the human body. Laika told them not to compare Sieg to ordinary people because he wasn't one of them. Then she asked if they knew what the upperclassmen had nicknamed Sieg and revealed that he was known as the Demon Child of the East Hall. This prompted Sieg to ask if the title was meant as an insult, after which he asked why Laika had come to see them in the first place and if she wanted to join the training session. Laika replied that training was, of course, fine, but first, she wanted to tell Sieg something. When Sieg asked what she was talking about, Laika informed him that it seemed they would soon see children from other dragon nests, and much sooner than expected. Rangus was clearly shocked by this news, while Reynold commented that he had suspected such an outcome, though he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. When Selena asked if this was related to their next trial, Laika replied that even she didn't know the details. Sieg asked where Laika had picked up such rumors, to which she replied that she had simply been observing the instructors, their conversations, and their movements. Sieg remarks that he had never paid attention to such things, that is, to gossip and rumors from the instructors, unlike Laika. Laika replied that, in any case, they needed to be careful because that very guy was studying in the West Hall. By that guy, she meant one of the candidates for the next head, besides herself and Sieg. Sieg just said that now it sounded really fun. A few days later, the students of the Eastern Dragon's Nest gathered in the arena. Among them were several students who were being introduced for the first time. Sieg noticed that everyone had been gathered in the arena without any division by class, and Laika agreed, adding that, just as she had predicted, they were about to meet students from other dragon's nests. Soon, the students suddenly fell silent at a loud noise. It was Freya, who immediately ordered everyone to calm down. And as soon as the students lined up before her, Freya announced that something very important would happen in 3 days. After all, a very interesting event awaited them. They would be fighting against students from other dragon's nests. All the team members tensed up, and Rangus was completely drenched in sweat. Only Zika's face showed a broad smile. Freya repeated again that in 3 days they would have to battle children from other dragon nests, also known as dragon halls. The students were outraged. Battles between dragon halls usually only happen at graduation. They didn't understand why such a serious trial had been arranged right now. Freya explained that there were reasons for this, but she couldn't go into details yet. Then she added one more detail she wanted to mention. The winners of the matches will be entrusted with a special mission. Sieg, intrigued by Freya's words, decided with anticipation that the situation was getting more and more interesting. Freya announced that the tournament would be a single elimination bracket, with 7 fighters from each dragon hall. The students were required to choose the best themselves and finalize the selection today. A senior asked whether the fighters would be chosen only from their own ranks. Freya cut him off, She had gathered everyone, which meant participants would be selected from every class. This made several upperclassmen look slightly shocked, and they immediately began to protest that the underclassmen wouldn't stand a chance against students from other dragon halls. According to them, there wasn't a single underclassman capable of fighting on equal terms with the upperclassmen, since all the underclassmen were simply weaklings. However, before leaving, Freya stated outright that she didn't care one bit, and that they had to resolve this issue among themselves by the end of the day. Freya left, and Rick ordered the underclassmen to listen. The 7 fighters would be selected only from the upperclassmen. He defiantly asked if anyone had any objections. Laika was outraged. The lower grades had equal rights to the tournament. She told Rick that his decision was unfair and that fighters should be selected from everyone. Rick looked at Laika with a mocking smirk and said that she seemed to be missing the point. According to him, the subject of their discussion was solely each person's abilities. He added that no matter how noble Laika's lineage might be, it meant absolutely nothing in a contest of skills. In response, Laika slowly walked toward Rick, releasing her aura. Demonstrating the power of 3 stars, she asked if it was truly only about abilities when selecting those who would fight against the other dragon halls. The elders were in shock. Laika had reached 3 stars, even though rumors had insisted she was only at 2. They couldn't understand how she had managed to make such a rapid breakthrough. Laika merely noted that she agreed with Rick's assertion that strength and skills should be the basis for selecting participants. She asked Rick if there were 7 seniors stronger than her. He flew into a rage and snapped back that Laika surpassed them only because of her special blood. Rick insisted that, aside from Laika, the younger ones were worthless trash and wouldn't stand a chance against the elders. At that moment, Sieg interrupted him, saying he was making too much noise. Rick, furious, demanded that he repeat his insolence. Sieg mockingly confirmed that he was too loud and annoying, which made the senior's rage flare up. Then Sieg calmly asked Rick if he really believed that all the underclassmen were just weaklings and trash in the eyes of the upperclassmen. Rick fell silent in shock when Sieg's expression changed and his aura surged outward. Sieg asked if the upperclassmen would agree to everyone fighting each other until only 7 students remained standing. At this, Laika immediately clutched her head, saying that Sieg's proposal was a huge problem. She also commented that his idea was far too cruel. Then Laika explained what she had actually meant to say. She proposed holding qualifying tournaments and allowing anyone who wanted to participate in the competition in 3 days, regardless of their year. She asked the upperclassmen what they thought of her proposal, adding that if they were confident in their abilities, there shouldn't be any problems. Rick agreed with Laika's proposal, though he thought it would be a waste of time and that they'd be better off training. When the upperclassmen turned away, Rick glanced back at Laika and Sieg, after which Laika asked Sieg if he would participate in the tryouts, and he immediately confirmed it. He also added that Rangus, Selena, and Raymond should join as well. The trio was a little shocked, and Rangus hastily asked if Sieg was serious about making them participate in the tryouts and compete against the upperclassmen. Sieg confirmed this without hesitation, noting that they had been training with him all this time, and if they couldn't show results now, when would they ever be able to demonstrate? Selena felt immense pressure before the fight against the older students. Raymond simply stated that since Sieg had made up his mind, all they could do was give it their all. Laika was excited to fight side by side with her friends and suggested the other underclassmen join them, but they just whispered nervously, afraid of the 3-star fighters. Hearing this, Sieg sighed heavily and asked his comrades why they lacked motivation so badly. He explained to them that it was precisely in battles against stronger opponents that they could gain the most experience, and added that at the moment, he simply wanted to see the so-called abilities of their upperclassmen. The seniors drew their weapons and grumbled. The juniors' selfishness had become a headache. They were convinced that the juniors were just wasting their effort and had no chance of winning. Rangus and the others trembled with anxiety. The seniors mockingly suggested they go easy on them, since, apart from Laika, the juniors were just 2-star babies. Sieg noticed the gloom on Rangus and the others' faces, so he asked if the upcoming battle frightened them. Rangus confirmed it. 3-star seniors were facing them. Then Sieg reminded them that for the past 5 years they had trained hard alongside him and achieved excellent results, so they should believe in themselves more. Selena and Raymond were inspired by Sieg's words, but Rangus still couldn't shake his nervousness and continued to fret over the upcoming match. Suddenly, the seniors shouted for them to stop chatting and wasting time. He ordered the juniors to start the fight immediately, promising to put them in their place. However, less than a minute later, the spectators couldn't believe what they were seeing, immediately wondering what on earth was going on. The underclassmen easily defeated the upperclassmen. The spectators wondered if the upperclassmen were weak, but others objected, The ones they had faced were true monsters. Our protagonist smiled broadly, clearly delighted with the outcome of the battle, and he immediately praised and congratulated Rangis and the others. Sieg noted to himself that Rangis's parrying techniques and his ability to spot gaps in the defense had become much sharper. Selena was also excelling at the multi-strike art of the Windflower Sword, and Raymond's ability to seamlessly switch between shield and sword techniques struck Sieg as quite impressive. In Sieg's opinion, they had all demonstrated excellent results from their training, and at this rate, if they gained confidence through real combat, it would only benefit them. Sieg also thought that Lika had grown stronger as well, and with her lightning aura, she could defeat opponents with a single attack. While the other high school students were still in disbelief at the speed and brutality of the fight they had witnessed, Lika commented that she thought it was absolutely right to decisively crush her opponent, to teach them a lesson for their arrogance. However, Rick couldn't accept the outcome of the battle, insisting that 3-star high schoolers could never lose to 2-star sophomores. At that moment, Sieg approached him and called Rick naive, since even after seeing the results with his own eyes, he continued to spout such nonsense. Leaning closer to Rick, Sieg explained that age and star ratings were merely arbitrary indicators, since in a real fight, the strong were simply those who won. Sieg added that if the upperclassmen were weak, they lost, and that was the end of it. Rick suddenly pointed his finger at Sieg, yelling at him and calling him stupid. He insisted that the number of stars was equivalent to strength, and asked if Sieg really didn't even know such basic things. Sieg calmly replied that regardless of whether Rick had stars or not, if his heart were destroyed, he would die anyway. Rick fell silent for a moment when Sieg advised him not to lose sight of the very essence of power, because in battle, power lay solely in whether a person could win or not, and nothing more. Then Rick shouted again, demanding that Sieg answer who he thought he was. He declared that he wouldn't let some brat twist logic and wouldn't hold back in battle anymore. Sieg merely replied that he was already tired of their verbal sparring, noting that children should behave like children and move their bodies, not their tongues. Since only the two of them remained in the arena, he asked Rick to demonstrate the martial arts he had mastered and was so proud of, as well as to show just how hard he had trained. This only made Rick boil with rage, and he shouted at Sieg not to underestimate him. Rick immediately lunged forward, using his technique of great power and pouring all his might into it. However, before Rick's attack could even reach its target, Sieg's eyes suddenly flashed with a golden light, and with a single blow to the face, Rick was sent flying to the other end of the arena. After that, Sieg even laughed, acknowledging that Rick had indeed trained quite well. Because of Sieg's remark, the entire audience fell silent, as did Rick himself, who remained kneeling on the ground. The students agreed with Lika. Sieg was truly ridiculous. They claimed that Rick had trained in vain, since Sieg had defeated him before he'd even had a chance to show anything. Meanwhile, on the training grounds of the West Hall, students could be seen groaning in pain and clutching various parts of their bodies due to injuries sustained after the fight. Sighing deeply, one of the guys remarked that every single one of them was completely useless. This guy was one of the candidates for the position of the next head of the family, Gilfas Eldragon. Shortly after that, other students approached, and one of them addressed him as Lord Vanilla, reporting that the selection process here had already been completed. This man was Alan, Vanille's right-hand man, a 3-star fighter, and standing behind him were other students of the same rank who had passed the selection, including Riton, who was also 12 years old. Just like all the other main characters in the story. Vanille immediately noticed Retin and called him over, asking if it was true that he had already reached the 3-star level despite being a lower-grade student. When Retin confirmed this, Vanille praised him, saying that he liked such competent people, and added that if Retin proved useful, he would make him one of his subordinates. Retin immediately bowed and thanked Vanilla, thinking to himself that Lord Vanilla had recognized his strength, and that with him, the West Hall would never lose to the others. Retin also believed that if they achieved excellent results in the special mission, Lord Vanille would become the next head of the Eldragon family, and when that happened, he would become a direct subordinate of the family. Then Alan approached Vanille and told him he needed to inform him of something. When Vanille asked what was the matter, Alan whispered that apparently Lady Lika would be participating in the Eastern Hall's selection team. This made Vanilla scratch the back of his head in irritation, and with displeasure clearly visible on his face, He declared that Lika was an endlessly annoying thorn in his side. Then he stood up and said that it didn't matter, because no matter how outstanding Lika was, they would still be the winners. Vanilla once again proclaimed that they would win and complete a special mission, and prove to his older brothers that the place of the next head of the family rightfully belonged to him. His face twisted into an evil grin as he held his weapon, a deadly fan of blades, in front of him. On the day of the selection, all the participants gathered, as well as students of the Dragon's Nest from various dragon halls. Due to the huge number of students who came to watch, Rangus couldn't help but get nervous, muttering about how many people had gathered in the arena. Then Lika explained that most of the students from different halls had gathered. The students gathered to watch the selection process. Lika noticed that after the exams, many had been eliminated and the ranks had thinned. She asked Rangus if he agreed with this. Rangus remained silent, agreeing with Lika. He thought that those who flew out of the dragon's nest were called pseudo-dragons. That's what his father had once been called. Lika immediately noticed the sadness on Rangus's face, so she quickly changed the subject. Lika patted Rangus on the back and said the main thing was that they had been chosen to represent the Eastern Hall. He agreed and promised to give his all in the upcoming selection. Soon after, they noticed the protagonist standing quietly among the selection participants. Rangus asked if anything was wrong, and Lika noticed that Sieg was unusually quiet today. He replied that there was no problem. He was simply assessing the strength of the surrounding students. Suddenly, Rangus fell to the ground in shock as they heard a loud voice proclaim that this was to be expected from Lord Sieg, since he was capable of even such a thing. When Sieg turned towards the source of the voice, he saw two students running towards them, and at the same time, he casually noted that everything had definitely changed. Two high school students, who were also participants in the selection and were running towards him, immediately agreed with Sieg's words. Rick added that after their battle, they had reconsidered their way of thinking, and although he was part of Eldragon, he truly respected the strong. Sieg simply replied that there was nothing wrong with it, so everything was fine. Meanwhile, Rangus burst into tears, clinging to Sieg's legs and complaining about how much Rick's sudden scream had scared him. And while the others helped him up, Sieg thought to himself that every participant in the selection from the various dragon halls was at the 3-star level, with the exception of some representatives of the East Hall. As he expected, there were no 4-star students among the participants, but there were several who already had 1 foot on this step. That's why Sieg was excited about what kind of techniques he would get to see this time, while they continued talking with Rangus. Some girl suddenly hugged Lika from behind, and Lika immediately recognized her as Sandy. Because of Lika and Sandy's loud voices, Sieg also paid attention to them. Still hugging Lika, Sandy said they hadn't seen each other in a while and asked how she was doing. She also asked if anyone was bullying Lika, but she simply replied that she was fine. When Selena asked who the girl was hugging Lika immediately introduced her as her cousin, Sandy Typhon, the daughter of the head of the Typhon family. This shocked Rangus and the others, as Sandy was also a member of one of the 4 great families. In a serious tone, Sandy asked Lika who these children were, to which Lika replied that they were her comrades and also friends. Sandy then asked if Lika was sure they were her friends, noting that while it was good to get along with other children, they lacked the ability to be Lika's companions, as she was one of the candidates for the post of the next head of the Eldragon family. Sieg immediately intervened, stating that this would only become clear when they fought. When Sandy asked who he was, Lika quickly replied that it was Sieg, and he was also one of the candidates, just like her. Sandy immediately asked if he was really a candidate, and if he was the rumor about the current head of the family's illegitimate child. She stated bluntly that she would never have thought that such a simple bastard as Sieg could still be alive. Despite Sandy's harsh words, Sieg continued to smile. Lika was shocked by Sandy's behavior in front of Sieg and his friends. Sandy, meanwhile, was surprised. Sieg, the bastard, was a rival for the leadership position. Sandy called Sieg's group pathetic, as no one had even reached 3 stars. Sieg suddenly intervened, pouting slightly, and warned Sandy that if she continued to look down on them like she was now, she would end up with nothing herself. Sandy's expression instantly darkened. She narrowed her eyes and asked Sieg to repeat what he had just said, wondering if a pathetic bastard with no support other than the blood of the head of the family really dared to lecture her. Sieg calmly replied that his words were not advice, but a warning. This caused Sandy to flare up in anger, but another student quickly intervened and said that Sandy shouldn't have caused trouble for the other teams. The student introduced himself as Aegis Vanblade, a representative of the Northern Hall. While Rangus tried to remember who Aegis was, Sandy told him not to interfere, stating that they were in the middle of an important conversation. However, Aegis smiled and replied that he couldn't let things slide, as the qualifying battle was about to begin. While the students continued to chat while waiting for the selection to begin, the man who suddenly appeared attracted everyone's attention, and all the students turned their gaze to him. The team didn't stay away. Rangus, Lika, and Sandy suddenly fell silent. Leica and her sister also stood at attention and waited for words, while Zeke smiled happily in anticipation of the coming battle. The start of the selection process was announced by Teach Mentric, captain of the Golden Dragon Corps, known as the Educator. He declared the start of the elimination tournament for all 4 halls. According to him, the 4 halls were to be divided into 2 groups, and the halls that emerged victorious from each group would face each other in the final. He added that the fight format will be one-on-one duels, with each gym fielding its fighters in turn, following a predetermined order of 7 participants from each gym. Mentric also explained that the first gym to defeat 4 opponents would be declared the winner, and once the match began, no changes in the order of fights would be allowed. Because of this, the order of performances itself had to be carefully thought out as part of each hall's strategy. In conclusion, Mentric announced that those who qualify for these matches will be given a special mission of great importance to the Eldragon family. Anyone who takes part in this mission will make a significant contribution to the development of the family, and for Lika and Vanille, receiving such merits would mean taking a huge step towards the head's chair. After this, Mentric announced that they would now determine the tournament bracket and called forward representatives from each hall to draw a stone from the box. The first one he called was Vanille Fafnild, the representative of the Western Hall. As Vanilla approached the officer holding the box, he immediately put his hand in there and pulled out a stone. After this, Mentric immediately sent him back to his place. While Vanilla was recovering, a drop of sweat rolled down Lika's face as she glared at her older brother, who was also looking at her and her group with an evil grin. Zeke quickly noticed this and asked Lika if she knew this man. Lika immediately confirmed it, telling Zeke that this guy was the candidate for head of the Western Hall she had mentioned earlier. None other than Vanille Fafnild Eldragon. A slight smile appeared on his face as he considered this information. Besides Vanille, the Western Hall as a whole contained many powerful warriors. Not only that, Zeke could also tell that the other gyms were also well-trained, although everyone could clearly feel the difference in strength between them. Soon, Zeke's gaze fell on Retin, and he thought that it had been a long time since he had last seen that face. Zeke recognized Retin's skills even during the exam. The fact that he'd achieved 3 stars at 12 years old made Zeke smile. Retin had clearly trained himself to the bone. At that moment, Retin suddenly noticed Rangus, and his expression darkened with hostility as he wondered why Rangus had even been included in the current selection. The students who recognized Rangus were also shocked, and some even shouted out in surprised questions about what the loser Rangus was doing in the arena. This made Rangus nervous again. When Raymond noticed this, he immediately asked if Rangus was okay. Rangus replied hesitantly that he was fine, while Retin continued to glare at him with obvious malice. Shortly after, Mentric called a representative from the Northern Hall. After Aegis pulled the stone from the box, Mentric called the representative of the Southern Hall, who took his stone with the same ease and stern expression on his face. Finally, he called the last representative from the East Hall. Upon hearing this, Lika immediately told Zeke that he was being called forward, causing Zeke to look at her in confusion and asked why he should be their representative. Lika calmly replied that the reason was simple. He was the strongest in their group. Rick and the others immediately agreed with her, while Zeke questioned whether it might not be better to send the youngest member of the group instead in situations like this. Lika asked him what he meant, noting that they were the same age. She told Zeke to go get the stone. He stepped forward, representing the Eastern Hall. However, Sandy suddenly became indignant at why a bastard like Zeke was chosen as the representative, and not Lika herself. Lika simply replied that it was because Zeke was the strongest among them. But even so, Sandy didn't believe her, since Zeke wasn't even at the 3-star level like Lika. She also reminded Lika that the selection was essentially a battle of the head candidates between her and Vanille, and that at this rate, Lika would likely lose. Lika just smiled and said that everything was fine and there wouldn't be any problems, confidently declaring the strength of their team. After Zeke removed the last stone from the box, Mentric instructed the representatives of each hall, having said that they all must direct the energy of their source into the elongated stones. As soon as they did this, the stones began to glow, turning either blue or red. Mentric explained that the colors would determine the tournament bracket and announced that in the first match, the East Hall will face the North Hall, and then the West Hall will face the South Hall. Upon learning that their first opponent would be the Northern Hall, Zeke's group immediately turned their attention to Sandy and Aegis's team. They soon noticed one particularly tall student, and at the sight of his appearance, Rengis winced in shock at the piercing gaze, asking if this giant was truly a student of the dragon's nest. Lika confirmed this, although she did not expect that they would face Sandy's team in the very first match. Meanwhile, Sandy released her lightning aura and told Lika that this was a great opportunity to bring her back to her senses. Pointing to Lika's team, Sandy declared that she would crush Lika to smithereens so that she would remember her place and purpose in life. Lika, however, didn't flinch. As her golden lightning aura surged forth, she told Sandy to attack. At the same time, clutching the blue stone in his hand, Sieg noticed Aegis smiling calmly, saying that it looked like they would be fighting in the first match, and that he was looking forward to it. Seeing Aegis's reaction and hearing his words, Sieg replied that it seems like they would get along, adding that he too was looking forward to the battle and couldn't wait for the fight to begin. Meanwhile, while Aegis held his dagger and sat, and after a short pause of silence filled the entire arena, Mentric announced that the first match will take place very soon, and he will pass between the eastern and northern halls. There they were already standing, with smiles on their faces. As soon as everyone heard this announcement, Rick immediately assured Lord Sieg that he would do everything in his power to win his fight. However, despite his resolute words, his expression gave him away, causing sweat to trickle down Lika's cheek as she nervously asked Sieg if Rick could really handle it. His anxiety was all too obvious. Sieg merely agreed with her observation. Soon after, Mentric asked if both groups were ready for the match, and as soon as Rick stepped into the center of the arena face-to-face with his opponent, Mentric immediately gave the command to begin the battle. Having gathered the energy of his source into a fist, Rick immediately rushed at the enemy. Sieg wondered what the outcome of Rick's match would be. Lika predicted it would be a tough fight, and quickly asked Sieg's opinion on the matter. Sieg simply replied that there was no guaranteed victory in any battle, unless it was himself, as he was confident that his victories were always absolute. Then Lika clarified that she didn't mean him, but Rick, so Sieg decided to just focus on watching the fight. Sieg added that in terms of skill alone, the North Hall fighter wasn't much different from Rick, and if Rick fought the way he usually did, he should win. Lika immediately agreed, but noted that it was the first time they had fought in front of such a huge crowd, and the pressure of representing their team was also a heavy burden. As Rick continued to receive relentless blows from his opponent, Sieg acknowledged the truth of Lika's words, although he mentioned that Sandy and Aegis Vanblade were exceptions. Sieg explained that both Sandy and Aegis were already on the verge of reaching the 4-star level, meaning they wouldn't be easily knocked off their game. He also remembered that Sandy was Lika's cousin from the Typhon family, which most likely meant that she possessed techniques from the same bloodline, and silently noted that this would be valuable combat experience for Lika. After Rick was eventually defeated by his opponent, Mentric declared North Hall the winner of the first match. Marin was extremely nervous, but hesitantly declared that she had to win. Lika tried to reassure her, asking her not to worry, everything would be fine. But just a moment later, Marin was also defeated by her opponent, leaving Sieg and Lika to sigh heavily. A trembling Rick and Marin apologized to Sieg for their losses, but Sieg just laughed and replied that he already knew they were completely overwhelmed by the atmosphere in the arena. He added that they had nothing to worry about, because if this had been a real battlefield where life and death were at stake, the results would certainly have been different. Sieg reminded them they were here to learn and test their strength, not to kill. He explained that such lessons were a unique experience that could only be safely gained within these walls, and that their failures would become fodder for them on the real battlefield in the future, so they just needed to continue honing their skills. Hearing this, Rick and Marin quickly perked up. However, their team had already suffered 2 losses in a row, making the next match extremely important, and Sieg immediately asked Rengis if he understood this. Rengis, already filled with fear and shock, begged Sieg not to make him even more nervous, telling him that he had been worried since the morning, and to top it all off, he had to face the largest and most fearsome member of the Northern Hall. Seeing the glowing red eyes of his opponent, Rengis burst into tears and hugged Sieg, sniffling. His high school opponent had scared the living daylights out of him. Sieg reminded him that they'd fought high schoolers before, but Rengis insisted. No one in the East Hall looked as terrifying as this enemy. Rengis admitted that fighting such a terrifying enemy in front of a crowd was unbearable. Sieg only sighed, gently holding his head. Sieg then put his arm around Rengis and told him to watch his opponent closely, asking what weapon he was holding in his hands. Looking more closely, Rengis saw the enormous sword his opponent was carrying. When Rengis told Sieg that his opponent was using a sword, Sieg confirmed this and explained that Rengis simply had to fight the man holding the sword, so he didn't need to think about anything else. Sieg explained that if the enemy lunges, you need to parry. If he strikes from below, you need to retreat. and if he swings from above, you need to step forward and strike with the spear. Sieg emphasized that Rangis simply needed to focus on countering the weapon in front of him, just like he always did. Thanks to Sieg's words, Rangis gradually gained confidence. When Sieg looked into Rangis's eyes, he realized how impressive his concentration was. Sieg understood that Rangis still needed guidance to focus, but once he could naturally enter that state of focus, he would grow far beyond his current capabilities. As Rangis and his opponent walked to the center of the arena, Sieg couldn't help but wonder how much this fight would help Rangis grow. Meanwhile, the spectators quickly noticed the colossal difference in size between Rangis and his opponent, commenting that the skinny Rangis didn't stand a chance against him. After Mintrick gave the signal to start the match, Rangis's opponent immediately rushed forward and used the three-leaf sword-style technique, called the single-blade branch. But before the attack could reach its target, Rangis quickly dodged her by jumping back. Despite this, the giant enemy declared that Rangis would not be able to escape from him, and using the double fang branch technique, unleashed a barrage of attacks. However, Rangis skillfully dodged and parried each blow. But even so, Lika remained extremely worried, and Selena noticed that Rangis's opponent was gradually getting closer, closing the distance. Raymond quickly asked Sieg if Rangis would be okay, but Sieg assured them there was no reason to worry, pointing to Rangis's eyes and noting that he had become increasingly focused as the battle progressed. After dodging the enemy's sword swing again, the giant used another three-leaf sword-style technique called the Leaf Storm Dance to attack Rangis. But before the blow reached him, Rangis's eyes suddenly flashed with clarity. He immediately used his Cloud Water Spear-style technique, called Floating Clouds in Water, to parry the sword. The force of their collision caused the giant opponent to lose his balance, and Rangis, without wasting a second, seized the opportunity. Using another Cloud Water Spear-style technique called the Turbulent Stream Strike, Rangis thrust his spear into his opponent's chest, knocking him unconscious, and immediately knocked this lifeless carcass to the ground. Mintrick immediately announced the end of the match, and proclaimed that the East Hall had won the third duel. Rangis finally breathed a sigh of relief, thanking the higher powers for this victory, while Sieg smiled and stated that now they must begin to turn the tide of the battle. Starting with Rangis's victory, the Eastern Hall steadily gained momentum. Selena won the fourth match, and Reynolds won in the fifth. Soon, the sixth fight between Lika and Sandy began. Lika greeted Sandy, noting that it had been a while since they had last crossed swords like this, despite both of them being proficient in thunder and lightning techniques. Sandy admitted she never expected the elite of the Northern Hall to lose to junior students who hadn't even reached the 3-star level. Lika calmly replied that, as she had said earlier, her comrades were strong. Sandy agreed mockingly, admitting that she had underestimated Lika's companions, but she stated that the main problem between the two of them was not that at all. When Sandy released her golden aura, Lika visibly flinched and became nervous. Sandy declared that Lika's companions were of secondary importance, and that if she truly wanted to become the head of the family, she herself would need overwhelming force. However, she was only second in the East Hall. Sandy wondered if Lika truly understood how dangerous her situation was. Lika replied that she was perfectly aware of her situation, and glancing at Sieg, who was standing behind her, she added that she never abandoned her thoughts of becoming the head of the family, or of surpassing her sister Sandy, because she believed that her current strength was enough to defeat her. To this, Sandy replied that she would like to personally verify this confidence. As soon as Sandy activated her ability, she disappeared from Lika's sight, leaving the audience in shock. In the blink of an eye, Sandy appeared behind Lika, saying that she wanted to see her so-called power with her own eyes. Lika quickly defended herself with her sword, and the lightning was quickly reflected by the iron. But Sandy suddenly ducked in front of her and launched another attack. While they were exchanging powerful blows, Aegis watched the fight, noting that, as expected, the advantage was on Sandy's side. Although he wondered how well Lika could stand up to someone who was even better at wielding the two-handed lightning sword than she was. When Sandy used the two-handed lightning sword technique called Judgment, and Lika immediately received a wound in the side, blood spurted from her body, which caused Selena and Marin to panic. Stepping back, Lika reassured herself that everything was okay with her, realizing that the wound was just a scratch, and she just needed to catch her breath. Rangis commented that Sandy was incredibly strong, marveling at how quickly Lady Lika was pushed back, while Reynolds mentioned that according to rumors, Ms. Lika had studied with Ms. Sandy in her youth. Then, Lika launched a new attack on Sandy, but she, having easily dodged, noticed that Lika still hadn't gotten rid of her bad habit of swinging her sword randomly when she was driven into a corner. Lika ignored this remark and rushed forward, and when their lightning auras collided with their blades, a powerful explosion thundered in the center of the arena. During their furious exchange of blows, Lika received multiple injuries. After this, Sandy stated that, as she expected, Lika's bad habits had not improved at all, and that she couldn't even reach first place in the East Hall. Sandy added that if Lika had simply joined the North Hall, she would never have allowed her to get to this point. Despite her wounds, Lika slowly rose and declared that the fight was not over yet. Sandy replied that she would be better off giving up, because at her current level, she couldn't beat her. Sandy even said that if she had known that things would turn out this way, she should have approached her father from the very beginning and forcibly transferred Lika to the Northern Hall. Lika remained silent, and when she raised her sword again, Sandy noticed that Lika was being stubborn, leaving her no choice but to teach her a lesson. In a flash of light, Sandy disappeared again and appeared behind Lika, surrounded by lightning, beginning another attack. As soon as Lika tried to defend herself with a sword, Sandy kicked her in the side, quickly throwing him off balance. She then struck him again with her sword. Sandy unleashed a relentless barrage of attacks on her, as a result of which, Lika received wounds all over her body. And then the beloved older sister flew into the air to deliver another crushing blow. Selena and the others became extremely worried, and Rangus turned to the protagonist for help. But Zeke watched calmly, noting that Lika looked as if she was ready to break through another barrier. As Sandy prepared a new attack, she told Lika that she would be better off surrendering. And while Lika did not give up trying to defend herself with her sword, her sister used the first secret technique of the Lightning Greatsword art. Engulfing Lika in a golden storm of lightning, the spectators fell silent, wondering if the fight was over. They were in shock, and Sandy stood in the arena like a newly minted winner. After that, few people got up, but soon she was shocked when Lika rose to her feet again, saying that she now finally understood how powerful Sandy's sword techniques truly were. Sandy couldn't hide her disbelief, wondering how Lika was still standing when her last attack was supposed to be the finishing blow. Lika acknowledged Sandy's point, saying that a past version of herself would have been defeated by this attack. At this time, Zeke looked at her with undisguised pride. After all, she had also been training tirelessly for the past 5 years, and their fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. Before the fight between Sandy and Lika began, Zeke asked if anything was bothering Lika, as she was acting out of character. Zeke also asked if she was nervous, and Lika admitted that she was, since her opponent was supposed to be none other than her sister Sandy. When Zeke asked for clarification, Lika explained that it was her sister who first taught her the basics of the art of the two-handed lightning sword. She learned the basics from her uncle, the current head of the Typhon family. But whenever she didn't understand something, she would turn to her sister Sandy for guidance, making her something of a mentor to her. Zeke replied that he understood everything. Then Lika admitted that she had never been able to defeat Sandy. She said that although she had gotten stronger over the past 5 years, Sandy had trained just as hard as she had. She couldn't honestly say she was confident of beating her sister. Zeke calmly replied that in that case, Lika should do something. He hugged her and said that she should remember their training together, and that she needed to refresh her memory of those 5 long years they had spent training side by side. However, at that moment, when Lika remembered their training, the long 5 years of hard work and beatings, her face suddenly contorted as if she was ready to burst into tears from disappointment, which prompted Zeke to jokingly ask if training with him had been that bad. Zeke then explained that Lika's greatest weakness was her tendency to let her emotions narrow her focus whenever battles became intense. That's why, for the past 5 years, their training is focused on helping her stay calm during a fight. Lika agreed, saying that Zeke had certainly attacked her quite unceremoniously during their training, but Zeke merely winked and replied that that was what true fighting spirit was all about. This only made Lika even more angry, and she asked what kind of spirit he was talking about and how it could even be considered a spirit. Zeke simply replied that the results of those training sessions were definitely making themselves felt, and that now Lika should be able to calmly analyze the enemy's movements even during battle. Lika admitted that might be true, but she still wasn't sure if it would be enough to help her against Sister Sandy. Zeke assured her that she would find out soon, once he came face to face with Sandy. Because when someone with Lika's talent truly observed his opponent's movements, he began to understand just how powerful that ability could be. Zeke also reminded her to remember that she was trained by him, the strongest of them all, so she no longer had to worry about her past results. Lika noticed that Sieg spoke about it as if it was something obvious, and immediately thanked him for helping her relax before the fight. Sieg then asked if Sandy was really the one who taught Lika the art of the two-handed lightning sword, and when Lika confirmed this, Sieg said that this would be the perfect opportunity for her. Just like in training, all she had to do was. It's important to watch Sandy's techniques closely, because if she does it right, she will surely become even stronger than her sister. Returning to the current battle, Lika stated that she had been closely observing her sister Sandy's swordsmanship, even taking her attacks head-on to study them thoroughly. And now she finally began to see through them. When Sandy asked what Lika was talking about, she suddenly rushed into attack despite numerous wounds. Due to the afterimages created by the movements of Lika's sword, Sandy couldn't tell if she had slowed down or stopped, which allowed Lika to land a successful strike. Lightning struck Sandy's body, and while she was still in shock from the sudden counterattack, Lika continued to rain down a merciless barrage of lightning-infused sword blows on her, leaving Sandy no choice but to endure every attack. As Lika rushed forward again, Sandy could only wonder what was happening and why Lika had suddenly become so fast. When Lika attempted to replicate Sandy's earlier finishing move, called Justice, the attempt initially failed. However, Lika quickly realized she lacked the ability to change tempo that Sandy possessed naturally. Now that the mistake was understood, all that remained was to put it into practice. Sandy countered that such skill was not something Lika could instantly copy simply by understanding its essence. Meanwhile, Rangus and the others watched in awe as Lika's movements and attacks suddenly changed. Sieg laughed with satisfaction, as he'd expected. Fighting a master of the same technique yielded astonishing insights. When Rick asked if Lord Sieg understood the sudden changes in Lika's movements, he merely confirmed his suspicions. Sieg explained that Lika had been learning her sister's swordsmanship while fighting, and that it was a direct result of their training, which allowed her to calmly analyze the enemy even under heavy fire. Rick replied that everything was clear to him now. Continuing to watch the battle, Sieg added that before, Lika would lose her composure during a fight, concentrating only on her own sword, but now she was different. She gained the composure to observe her opponent during a fight, and by learning the same swordsmanship in the heat of battle, she took it to a whole new level. Despite this, Sandy still couldn't believe that Lika had already managed to copy her techniques, insisting that such an inferior imitation would never defeat her. However, after another clash of their swords and lightning, Sandy was suddenly thrown back by the powerful blow. Unable to believe that Lika is superior to her, Lika immediately rushed back to Sandy, stating that, as far as physical fitness was concerned, she had spent the last few years training on the brink of death with someone special. Gathering lightning for her next attack, Lika told Sandy that this was now the true power of her lightning two-handed sword art, after which she unleashed her great thunder technique on her. The power was incredible. Sandy's eyes widened in pain from the attack, and the golden lightning of Lika's technique furiously swept across the entire arena. After finishing the attack, the watering can exhaled forcefully after its most powerful blow, and Sandy remained standing, struggling to catch her breath, and admitted that Lika had indeed become stronger, before finally collapsing to the ground, giving Lika victory. She stood there, covered in cuts. Her uniform was completely shredded, and the instructors proclaimed the victory of the Eastern Corps. Even Vanille couldn't believe the power Lika had shown, especially the way she had defeated Sandy. As Lika headed back to Sieg and the others, Sieg immediately praised her, saying that it looked like he wouldn't have to fight after all. Lika smiled happily and said that she was glad that she was able to ensure her team's victory. She also mentioned that if she lost, although she had no intention of doing so, it would be Sieg who would have to face Aegis in the next fight. This immediately prompted Sieg to ask if Lika knew Aegis personally. Lika replied that she didn't know him personally, but Aegis was extremely well known, for he was spoken of as the greatest genius ever born in the Van Blade family. Sieg muttered if that was true, thinking to himself that, judging by Aegis's aura, he really did stand head and shoulders above the rest of the participants in this tournament. Then Lika added that even for Sieg, the outcome of the fight with Aegis would be uncertain, and it's unknown how everything would have turned out. This guy is really very interesting. Meanwhile, Mintrick stepped into the center of the arena and announced that although the victory of the East Hall was already decided, the fights will still continue until the very end. Rangus and Sieg were both surprised by this statement. Lika noted that this was strange because she thought that the competition should have ended after 4 opponents were defeated. Sieg, however, remained silent, looking intently at Mintrick, and Aegis, who was already standing on the battlefield, could not stop wondering what they had planned. His opponent was as smiling and kind as always. Nothing about him gave away the appearance of a powerful warrior at first glance. But no matter what intrigues they had in mind, Sieg loudly declared that as long as he could fight, that alone was more than enough for him. Aegis then said that even though the Northern Hall may have lost, he was happy that he still had a chance to fight Sieg like this. When Sieg asked if Aegis really wanted to fight him that much, Aegis immediately confirmed it and explained that he meant that Sieg was the representative of the Eastern Hall. Despite Miss Lika's presence, Sieg was the one chosen. So how could he not be interested in who Sieg really was? Aegis also added that even if Sieg had the blood of the head of the family, from what he could sense, Sieg was only at the level of 2 stars, and yet he was chosen as a representative instead of the 3-star Mrs. Lika. And that was the main reason he wanted to fight him. Sieg listened silently to Aegis's words. A moment later, Sieg replied that, as he had expected, they seemed to be getting along, as he himself was eager to cross blades with Aegis. When Aegis asked if this was true, Sieg replied that there were many skilled fighters in this tournament, but Aegis was exceptional. Sieg also mentioned that he had heard of his reputation, being called a once-in-a-century genius at such a young age, and that he sincerely wanted to measure Aegis's strength in direct combat. Aegis replied that it was good, and slowly drew his katana, saying that his anticipation was growing with each passing minute. Meanwhile, Sieg immediately noticed that his opponent was using a katana, and it had been a while since he had last encountered someone who wielded that type of weapon. As soon as Mintrick announced the start of their fight, Aegis moved, and he rushed at Sieg with incredible speed, slightly catching him off guard, but at the same time, filling him with delight. Sieg noted that Aegis was able to cover such a huge distance with just one step, and he couldn't help but praise Aegis's footwork. Smiling confidently, Aegis immediately used his 1,000-blade style technique, called the 9 blades, to attack Sieg. Because of the golden glow of Aegis's aura, Sieg realized with shock that the presence of the enemy's katana seemed to have completely dissolved. However, before Aegis's attack could hit Sieg's body, Aegis himself winced as his blade cut through only Sieg's afterimage. Having completed his lunge, Aegis quickly realized that Sieg avoided his blow by twisting his body in a split second. Aegis admitted that he was confident that his attack would hit, but Sieg only smiled and praised the perfection of Aegis's strike, even asking him to show more of his techniques. Without hesitation, Aegis moved again with lightning speed and unleashed another 1,000-blade style technique known as the wave blade on Sieg. Watching Aegis's attack closely, Sieg commented that the trajectory of his blade was extremely difficult to calculate. Sieg was suddenly caught off guard when he realized that one of Aegis's attacks was coming from underground, something he had never anticipated, and with one blow of a jet of water, the main character was sent high into the air. Despite this, Sieg remained calm and continued to praise Aegis's skill, saying that although he had no intention of letting himself be hurt, the paths of Aegis's sword were still truly unpredictable. It was difficult to avoid them. At that moment, Sieg came to the conclusion that Aegis was a true genius, constantly changing their attack patterns without losing speed or power. The energy from the source of Aegis flowed flawlessly, without a single unnecessary movement, delivering sharp blows that perfectly timed Sieg's breathing and rhythm. Sieg understood that such skill was impossible without relentless training. Meanwhile, as Sieg continued to dodge every attack, Aegis admitted that he couldn't believe he hadn't managed to get him yet. Aegis praised Sieg, saying that he was truly incredible, and asked what kind of training Sieg had gone through. Sieg simply asked if Aegis really wanted to know how he trained, and then casually offered to let Aegis train with him after their battle was over. A moment later, Sieg suddenly rushed towards Aegis to deliver his own attack. As determination flashed in Sieg's eyes, he thrust his fist forward, aiming at Aegis. He immediately raised his katana to block the blow, but the sheer power behind Sieg's fist made Aegis's entire body tremble, leaving him baffled that Sieg was supposedly only at the 2-star level. Sieg noticed the wounds on his fist. Even with his breathing pattern altered, he realized Aegis had adapted. This forced Sieg to admit that his opponent was an even more remarkable warrior than he had imagined. Aegis then noticed that Sieg had finally landed an attack on him and asked if that meant Sieg was done learning his techniques. Sieg replied that, to some extent, that was true. Hearing this, Aegis wondered if Sieg had already figured out his abilities. Then Aegis unleashed another swift attack on Sieg. Watching the blow approaching, Sieg initially thought it was identical to the previous attacks, but was suddenly shocked when, just before the blade was about to reach him, Aegis abruptly changed the direction of his sword with his lingering shadow technique. The sudden change in trajectory prevented Sieg from reacting in time, resulting in Aegis successfully slashing Sieg across the chest. Having carried out a successful attack, Aegis happily asked, does he need to reveal more of his techniques to meet Sieg's expectations? Meanwhile, Sieg, clutching his chest, couldn't believe that Aegis had managed to wound him during their fight. However, Sieg, although beaten, continued to smile, admitting that their battle was becoming more and more exciting. Meanwhile, as the intense battle between Sieg and Aegis continued, Sandy slowly came to. When she opened her eyes, she still had no idea where she was. Her teammates immediately ran to her, anxiously asking if she was okay. Sandy quickly replied that she was fine. Soon after, she realized that she had lost her fight against Lika. Despite this, remembering how Lika had defeated her, Sandy couldn't help but smile, sighing quietly. Even though she was defeated, she was genuinely happy with the outcome of their fight and Lika's current strength. Afterwards, Sandy apologized to her team, saying that if she had won, they would still have had a chance to receive the special mission. However, her teammates immediately protested, insisting that they should be the ones apologizing for being a burden to her and Aegis. They all bowed their heads to Sandy, but she firmly stated that their thoughts were not true. According to Sandy, their opponents were simply that strong. She added that they simply needed to train harder to avoid losing next time. Hearing this, her teammates felt inspired, and their spirits were lifted. Sandy then asked if the battle between the Western and Southern Halls had already begun, but one of them pointed to the ongoing battle, saying that for some reason the current duel was still not over. The girl also told Sandy that the fight unfolding right now was truly incredible. When Sandy looked at the arena and saw the clash of two fighters, she could not help but feel shock, wondering what was going on there. She immediately realized that Aegis had used the 5 blades of aura, and this meant that he fought seriously and with full force. As Sandy continued to watch Sieg and Aegis fight, she remembered Lika's words that Sieg was the strongest in their group. This memory made her fall silent, because before she had not fully believed Lika's words. But now she realized that they were true. Meanwhile, Aegis used his 1000 battle style technique called 5 Shadows to attack the main character, but Sieg easily dodged it. Sweat immediately rolled down Aegis's cheeks as he couldn't believe that even this technique didn't work against Sieg. To top it all off, Aegis said that after such a long battle, Sieg wasn't even out of breath, and immediately asked what kind of body he had. Sieg simply replied that it was nothing special. He had simply put a lot of effort into training his basic endurance. He added that techniques are good, but the fundamentals are just as important. Aegis replied that he understood, saying that since that was the case, from now on he would pay more attention to training his body. He then used his ability again to attack the protagonist, but Sieg, using only his hands, shattered every blow aimed at him. At that moment, Sieg appreciated that the hardness, sharpness, and speed of creation and the blade's range were somewhere on the lower end of the high end. But given Aegis's age, he could become a very interesting opponent in the future. Sieg smiled, realizing that thanks to this fight with Aegis, he had finally confirmed one thing: the difference between what had been 1,000 years ago and the current era. According to Sieg, in martial arts thousands of years ago, the attack movement itself was of primary importance. The essence of martial arts was to express the entire universe through its techniques, and source energy was just an addition. But in the modern era, by releasing the energy of the source, practitioners express the entire universe through it. In other words, controlling the source energy itself has become the essence of modern martial arts. Continuing to dodge the attacks, Sieg thought to himself that he was a fool. He was so focused on the techniques themselves that he didn't notice the shift for too long. However, he found the changes that had occurred over the last 1,000 years immensely exciting. Meanwhile, continuing to attack, Aegis realized that all his blows were perfectly parried by Sieg. All he could do was conclude for himself that Sieg was truly a superhuman. Rangus and the others remained deeply concerned, and Rangus mentioned that the battle had been going on for over an hour now, with no sign of it ending. Lika, however, calmly replied that neither of them were normal, but their battle would probably end soon. Aegis then told Sieg that it seemed like he was done watching all of his movements this time. Sieg didn't deny it, replying that their fight had been a truly wonderful experience. Aegis agreed, adding that he felt the same way. Suddenly, the protagonist declared that he wanted to pay his respects to Aegis. Therefore, what he learned from their battle, he will now present it to Aegis in the form of a new technique. When Sieg clenched his fist, Aegis suddenly felt an overwhelming pressure. It felt like he was being shaken. Aegis laughed, saying that he now understood why he couldn't defeat Sieg. Despite this, he gathered all his power and activated the 1,000 Blades style secret technique called the Absolute 5 Blades Strike, declaring that he would continue to fight until the very end. However, before Aegis could land his blow, Sieg suddenly jumped high into the air. While in the air above the arena, he gathered the source energy into his fist and brought down a rain of giant golden fists onto the entire arena. This technique was a new move from Sieg, a modified second form of his dragon-smashing martial art, which he called the Fist Star. As a result, a series of explosions swept through different parts of the arena, causing the students watching to panic. And now, in front of his opponent, was the largest fist his technique could create. And when the attack finally hit Aegis, a colossal explosion shook the entire arena. Reynolds quickly raised his shield to protect his teammates, amazed at the sheer power of Zeke's attack. Sandy, meanwhile, was so stunned that she could only ask who won the fight. At this point, Mintrick declared that they had seen enough and declared the duel over. As the smoke gradually cleared, Aegis's broken katana became visible. Lying on the ground, Aegis could only laugh, saying he couldn't even move a finger. He admitted that Zeke's strength was overwhelming, and that he still had a lot of training to do if he ever wanted to catch up. And although Zeke continued to sweat from exhaustion, he smiled as victory was awarded to the East Hall. The spectators could hardly believe what they were witnessing, and kept asking what kind of battle they had just witnessed, as well as how Aegis had been defeated. Mintrick then announced that before the match between the Western and Southern Halls began, they would first repair the arena and ordered everyone to begin preparations. Rangus and the others were filled with admiration and joy, as they never expected Zeke to defeat Aegis. Lika commented that Zeke had once again destroyed the arena and that he was very strange in many ways. Zeke immediately asked what she meant, adding that the most important thing was his victory. He then said that what Lika meant didn't matter now because they needed to focus on watching the upcoming fight between the Western and Southern Halls. Lika agreed that this was true, adding that the next match would feature another candidate for the position of head of the family, none other than Fafnid Eldragon. Smiling, Zeke said that the Western Hall seemed to have the best overall quality of fighters, but in the South Hall, there were also guys who looked strong, so he was curious to see how their battle would turn out. However, contrary to Zeke's expectations, the match between the Western and the Southern Hall turned out to be completely one-sided. The screen showed the deadly dagger fan of that very monster, and Vanilla himself stood before his defeated opponent. His eyes reflected green, toxic anger and power. After the battle with Aegis, Zeke asked Rangus if he'd gone too far. With the arena so damaged, it wouldn't be repaired anytime soon. But Rangus reassured him and gestured toward the arena. Zeke was completely stunned and immediately asked how this was even possible and how they managed to restore the arena so quickly. Rangus then explained that the entire arena was built using a rare stone called aetherite, and when someone infused it with the source's energy, it could be restored to its original form. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately realized that this was another incredible material, one that had emerged during the 1,000 years of its absence. As Zeke continued to marvel at the spectacle, Rangus added that the use of such an expensive material to build an arena of this size was truly astonishing. After the battle of the Western and Southern Halls, Mintrick was plagued by doubts. He felt something was wrong with Vanille's duel. The fight had been alarmingly one-sided. He found it hard to believe Vanille could defeat Lila Sonar so easily. Meanwhile, Vanilla calmly asked Mintrick if he was going to announce the winner. Mintrick cast aside his doubts and declared the Western Hall, led by Vanille, the winner. He then announced that the final between the Eastern and Western Halls would begin in an hour. As the announcement echoed around the arena, the spectators remained unusually quiet, still unable to process what they had just seen. In contrast, Lila's teammates were deeply concerned about her condition. One of them carefully carried her away, while Lika watched in disbelief, unable to accept that Lila had been defeated without the slightest effort. Zeke remained silent, watching the proceedings. Deep down, Zeke was absolutely certain something was wrong. The gap in strength and ability between Lila and Vanille shouldn't have been so vast. However, for some unknown reason, the flow of power from Lila's source turned out to be completely unstable. In this state, there was no doubt that something had happened to her that was not quite right compared to her usual state of health. And this is precisely what explained why the fight ended so one-sided. Zeke also suspected that Mintrick, acting as referee, had also noticed something unusual. This left him quietly wondering what had really happened during Vanille and Lila's battle. Even Reynolds didn't believe Lady Lila Sonar was helpless. He acknowledged that the candidate for head of the family was, as expected, at a level beyond their reach. Selena noted that the fight seems too one-sided. Lika agreed, suggesting that this was the harsh reality. They were seeing the true power of the other gym leaders for the first time, making it difficult to judge whether anything was amiss. Rick then mentioned that Lord Zeke and Lady Lika were also candidates for the next chapters, meaning that Lord Vanille must also have incredible strength to match them. Although Selena and Lika were hesitant at first, they eventually nodded in agreement. Ranges, however, remained silent and distracted. When Rick asked what was bothering him, Ranges replied that it was nothing in particular. It was just that Lord Vanille was amazingly strong, and in general, everyone from the Western Hall seemed incredibly powerful. His words unintentionally undermined Reynolds' morale, causing Ranges to quickly apologize for saying such a thing before the match. Lika then said that Ranges was not wrong when he admitted that she too had lost her last match. And as frustrating as it was, she was still nowhere near the level of the West Hall. Rick replied that if Lika said so, he felt the same way. He couldn't defeat any of them, even with more stars. However, he had no intention of losing. Like Ranges and the others who had defeated stronger opponents, he wanted to do the same. They could still defeat the Western Hall. His unwavering determination reignited the others' fighting spirit. Watching them, Zeke thought their fighting spirit had finally returned to normal. It seemed like Marin and Rick might actually grow from this battle. However, right now Lika was a much greater concern. It seemed to Zik that Lika hadn't noticed the anomalous power of Lila's source at all. If she believed that everything that had happened was solely due to Vanille's power, then her profound shock made sense. But since Zeke himself didn't know all the details, he couldn't give her careless advice. He silently pondered what he should do. Soon, Rangas noticed the unusual expression on Lika's face and asked if she was okay. Lika immediately replied that she was fine, and as she left, she said that she just needed to clear her head. Later, in the garden outside the arena, Lika sat alone by the fountain. She couldn't believe that Vanilla had become so strong that he could crush Lila like that. Even Aegis couldn't completely defeat Lila without receiving a single scratch, and Vanilla did it without the slightest effort. Her hand plunged into the fountain while her head sank into thoughts. The last time Lika fought Vanille was when they were 5 years old, and she lost. Since then, she has trained tirelessly, determined to one day defeat him. She sincerely believed that she had finally caught up with him, but what she witnessed today shattered that confidence. If the battle order remains unchanged, Vanille's opponent will most likely be Zeke. Oddly enough, she felt a sense of relief at the thought, because it meant that she herself would not have to go against Vanilla. But she hated herself with all her heart for this feeling. It was as if she had already admitted her defeat, despite her years-long desire to surpass him. Suddenly, Vanilla himself appeared and asked what she was doing there. He remarked in a mocking tone that she looked terribly serious, sitting there all alone. Lika's eyes narrowed, and she demanded an answer to the question of what he wanted, stating that they had nothing to discuss, and she did not intend to talk to him. Vanille smirked and advised him not to be so prickly. He added that if he became the head of the Eldragon family, she could very well become his wife. Lika jumped up abruptly and ordered him to shut up, firmly declaring that she would be the head. She started to walk away, but Vanilla stopped her with his words. He said he knew perfectly well what she was thinking, that she could never win against him, and he admitted he couldn't blame her for that. After all, back then, she hadn't managed to overcome him either, and she certainly saw what he had just done to Lila. Casually putting his arm around her shoulders, he said that he was absolutely sure that after watching the fight, she was finally convinced of her own inability to defeat him and mockingly asked if he was mistaken. In response, Lika merely ordered him to remain silent once again. Then, Vanilla stated bluntly that she should have simply admitted it. Then, now, and forever, she would never be able to surpass him. He ordered her to surrender and submit, promising that if she did, he would treat her well. And as he said this, he squeezed her shoulder even harder. Lika immediately pushed his hand away and shouted at him to stop talking. Vanilla merely remarked condescendingly that her reaction was anything but cute. Without another word, Lika left. Watching her go, Vanilla muttered coldly that after he had hugged her and squeezed her shoulder so tightly, it was all over for her. He then turned to his subordinate and said that they both knew perfectly well what their next steps should be. The subordinate meekly replied that Vanille could rely on them completely. He then asked if they should prepare for the bastard, Zeke, just as they had prepared for Lika. Vanilla replied that they could deal with Zeke right during the match, or even prepare everything during the fight with him. While he admitted it would have been better to prepare in advance, Zeke struck him as unusually clever. If Zeke noticed their preparations, it would only complicate matters. In addition, judging by his observations, Zeke sometimes deliberately allowed himself to be hit, so arranging everything right in the middle of the battle would be quite enough, to which his subordinate readily agreed. After bumping fists with him, Vanille sneered, declaring that even if Zeke had defeated Aegis, he himself had no intention of losing to some bastard even without using tricks. And as the water in the fountain behind them slowly changed its color, Vanilla declared with unwavering confidence that they would win this match and take the special mission for themselves. An hour after the scheduled finale, Rick said nervously, "The moment of truth has arrived." However, deep down, he couldn't stop thinking about the harsh reality of their situation. He and Marin were high school seniors, but among all the representatives of the East Hall, they remained the weakest. The group from the West Hall, on the other hand, was clearly filled with elites. Because of this, Rick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease and doubt, wondering if they could really conquer the West Hall. Suddenly, a fist flashed through the air and hit him hard on the head. After hitting Rick, Sieg called him an idiot and loudly asked where all that confidence he had shown earlier had gone. When Rick admitted it was all just a publicity stunt, Sieg screamed and asked him why he'd even bothered fighting. Had he really gone into battle just to lose? Rick quickly responded that that wasn't the case at all. Sieg then told him that if he was going to fight, no matter the odds, he had to strive for victory, and that was what truly mattered. Thanks to these words, even though a large lump had formed on Rick's head from the blow, he suddenly felt his fighting spirit rise again and admitted that Sieg was right. Rick was determined to fight for victory. Sieg laughed and approved of this attitude. It was vital for the boy to believe in himself after all his hard training. Rick warmly agreed and thanked him. Rick fell silent when Sieg promised a parting gift. He told him to relax his shoulders. The essence of the great power fist style is to concentrate all his power in one place. If Rick strains too much, the power he was supposed to concentrate will simply dissipate instead. Sieg patted Rick on the shoulders and again told him to relax. At that moment, Rick felt a strange sense of relief and a wave of confidence. He smiled and said that right now he felt like he could actually win his fight. Sieg responded that that was a good feeling, and then told Rick to go out there and win. As Rick walked towards the arena, Lika noticed something odd. Sieg had never studied the great power fist style, but at the same time, he seemed to know almost everything about it. She also pointed out that Sieg sometimes seemed oddly knowledgeable about other martial arts. When she asked him what the reason was, Sieg just smiled and said it was a stupid question. He then calmly added that the answer should be obvious because he was Sieg. Hearing this, Lika could not believe that she had even deigned to ask such a question. Meanwhile, when Rick finally saw the enemy he was about to face, the first thought that came to his mind was that this man was a real monster. He'd already seen this man fight in the previous match, and yet this time, Rick felt a firm conviction that he wouldn't lose. At this point, Rick's opponent began to taunt him, saying that Rick was acting too cocky for someone who had already lost to some punks from the North Hall. Rick firmly told him to shut up, saying that he was no longer the same person he had been back then. However, his opponent asked with a grin if Rick was really so sure of that. At that very moment, Mintrick announced that the first match between the East and West Halls was declared open. Rick's opponent immediately rushed forward with a dagger in his hand. Rick was momentarily shocked by the man's incredible speed, and before he could fully react, the opponent used a dagger technique from the insect fighting style called the mantis strike, saying that a man like Rick could never change in just a couple of hours. Rick was forced to retreat, simultaneously blocking the attack. His opponent couldn't believe Riku had managed to defend himself using his aura. However, he had no intention of stopping. He challenged Riku to try and counter his next attack, and immediately unleashed a barrage of blows on him using a technique called swarming locust. Seeing Rick struggling desperately in his current situation, the enemy began to taunt him again, asking what the problem was and where all that confidence had gone. Meanwhile, having received several wounds from the enemy's merciless attacks, Rick admitted to himself that his enemy was indeed strong. But that did not mean that he could allow himself to be beaten so one-sidedly. Rick immediately countered with his fist, but his opponent easily dodged it, commenting that he was too slow. At the same time, Rick received another blow from his opponent, who confidently declared that such a pathetic attack would never touch him in his life. Rick realized he'd never catch his enemy at this rate. He wondered what he should do next. At that moment, he remembered Zeke's words about how he needed to relax his shoulders because the great power fist style concentrated all of his power into one point. Rick suddenly fell silent for a moment, after which he decided to put everything on one single attack. He wiped the blood from his face and returned to his fighting stance, beginning to concentrate his aura. Seeing this, his opponent sneered and rushed forward. Noticing that such a weakling as Rick turned out to be surprisingly stubborn, the enemy then used a technique called Stinging Bee Flash in an attempt to break through Rick's defense. However, taking the attack head-on, Rick suddenly smiled and said that he had finally caught him. His opponent was in shock and couldn't move anymore. After all, Rick had intercepted and blocked his weapon. He loudly declared that now it was time for the enemy to taste his attack. Gathering all the concentrated aura into his fist, Rick shouted loudly, and then he released a technique of the Great Power Fist style called Great Power Fist. A powerful blow sent his opponent flying straight into the arena wall. The audience fell into stunned silence. Meanwhile, Zeke and Leica just smiled contentedly when Mentric announced that the winner of the match was Rick from the East Hall. Rick's opponent was knocked unconscious after crashing into a wall. His eyes rolled back and turned completely white. It seemed like he even died. At first, the guy couldn't believe he had won and stood there with his mouth open. But then Rick's face immediately turned red with indescribable joy, and he could not help but let out an excited cry, celebrating his victory. Sometime later, when Rick's opponent came to his senses, he just couldn't believe that he had been defeated by some Rick. Holding his wounded hand, he suddenly heard someone call his name. It was Vanilla. The man quickly walked up to Vanilla, dropped to one knee, and began to apologize for the lost match. However, before he could even finish speaking, Vanilla suddenly attacked him. This brutal act caused great fear among the members of the West Hall, including Retin. Vanille then looked coldly at the rest of his companions and asked if they understood what was now required of them. He ordered them to mercilessly crush any enemy they encountered. None of them dared to object, and they all obeyed his order without question out of pure fear. Meanwhile, Rick confidently told Marin that she would definitely be able to win her fight. Marin nodded in agreement, while her opponent just looked at her seriously and unblinkingly. And when Mentric finally gave the signal to begin the battle, Marin immediately released her aura and rushed towards the enemy at high speed. Rushing forward, she used her red flame sword-style technique, called Sparking Slash, to deliver a swift strike. However, her opponent defended himself from the blow with incredible ease using a spear. With perfect timing, he deflected Marin's sword, causing her to lose her balance for a brief moment. Noticing the gap in her defense, her opponent quickly took advantage of it. Swiftly moving towards Marin, he immediately used the Great Wild Spear-style technique, known as the Furious Puncture, striking Marin hard in the side. The aura around them contracted at the point of impact. Due to the heavy damage sustained from the attack, Marin was unable to stay on her feet, falling to one knee and bursting into violent coughing. Before she even had time to come to her senses, her opponent, without the slightest hesitation, launched a new attack. As the beating continued, Ranges could hardly believe what was happening and only muttered that the situation looked very bad for Marin. Meanwhile, as blood continued to ooze from the wounds Marin received during the fight, Leica was shaking with anger at her opponent, and even Selena said she couldn't watch it anymore. Rick, screaming in anger, was about to lunge at Marin's opponent, but Reynolds quickly stopped him, firmly reminding him that he was strictly forbidden from interfering with the fight. The fight wasn't over, and if he interfered, their gym would be disqualified. After some time, Mentric finally announced that the winner of the match between Marin and her opponent was the West Hall. While Marin lay there unconscious, her opponent arrogantly stepped on her face. As soon as Mentric's announcement of victory echoed throughout the arena, Rick and the others immediately rushed to Marin's side. While Rick and Leica were overcome with deep anxiety at the sight of Marin lying in a pool of blood, Zeke remained silent, watching everything that happened. However, the undisguised anger on his face revealed how enraged he was by the severe injuries Marin had sustained. Ranges and Selena worried about Marin, while Rick desperately called for her. Selena noted that the enemy's wounds were too severe, and Ranges doubted she would survive. Zeke's face showed the strongest anger, but he continued to remain silent, calmly watching their enemies. As Marin's opponent began to leave the scene, Rick suddenly called out to him. Rick raised his voice and demanded to know if there was any need to go that far. The enemy's expression darkened slightly, and he turned around to ask if they had any problems. When Rick asked what he meant, the man simply replied that what had happened was a battle. In other words, a real fight, and he had simply given it his all to ensure his 100% victory over Marin. Rick was furious. Even for a battle, Marin's injuries were excessive. Selena backed him up, shouting that the enemy had no reason to go so far. The man merely smiled mockingly and said they were too naive. According to him, those from the Western Hall never showed mercy to their enemies in real combat. Pointing to Rick and the others, he said that in the West Hall, they simply crushed their enemies mercilessly. That's all. Leica asked the enemy if his actions had been ordered by Vanille. The man arrogantly replied that it didn't matter, and suggested they simply surrender. He asked Leica if she understood why the referee hadn't stopped the match. He explained that Marin had maintained her will to fight, and he simply had to break her completely. After that, he asked them if what he had done wasn't a completely natural course of events. Leica screamed again in anger, but Marin's opponent merely retorted that they were too noisy before turning his back on them. As he left, he mockingly advised them to worry about themselves first and then about their girlfriend, because they would all end up just like Marin. Shortly after, Retin suddenly intervened in the conversation and said that this is just the way life works. He added that they could very well surrender right here and now if they wanted. He then looked at Ranges and asked if he had heard what had just been said. Ranges' head snapped towards him, sweat slowly trickling down his cheek as he said Retin's name. Retin casually mentioned that it was time for Ranges to start calling him by his first name, then immediately asked if Ranges was planning to concede their match. Ranges remained deathly silent. Retin started to mock him again, saying that if Ranges wanted to be played with the same way as that Marin girl, he wouldn't stop him. He even asked if Ranges wanted him to do the same thing to him as he used to do to him back in the village, calling Ranges a pathetic weakling. Ranges lowered his head, his expression darkening. Lika was clearly furious at Retin's words, but Ranges suddenly told Lady Lika that everything was fine. Rising slowly to his feet, Ranges said he had no intention of running away. His words made Lika turn around and look at him in surprise. Then Ranges declared firmly that today, right here and now, he would surpass Retin. Retin immediately grimaced in irritation and demanded to know what Ranges meant. Meanwhile, while Marin remained unconscious, the medical team continued to treat her wounds, and the spectators watched the events unfold in complete silence. In the very center of the arena, Ranges took a deep breath, clutching his spear tightly, when suddenly someone called his name, causing him to flinch. Ranges was both confused and amazed, because he immediately recognized the voice. It was Sieg's. When he turned to look at him, Sieg calmly told him not to worry because no one else had heard them. According to Sieg, he spoke directly to Ranges' mind. He explained that he had recreated this technique several years ago after reading numerous books. While Ranges was wondering where to even begin to comment on what Sieg had just done, Sieg told him that, more importantly, he used the technique to give Ranges some valuable advice. When Ranges asked what advice he meant, Sieg replied, "There is a saying that clouds float freely and water flows smoothly." Ranges began to wonder what exactly Sieg meant by this proverb. Sieg continued, adding that the clouds floated carefree across the sky, and the water flowed surprisingly smoothly. He added that whenever Ranges was having a hard time, he should imagine this image in his mind. It was at this point that Mintrick asked what Ranges was doing. Ranges immediately apologized and quickly assumed a fighting stance. Mintrick then announced that the second battle between the Western and Eastern Halls was declared open. As soon as Ranges heard the signal to start the match, he rushed forward at maximum speed and used a cloud and water spear technique called Water Pierce to attack Retin. Retin was momentarily surprised by Ranges' speed, but he easily repelled the attack and deflected the spear. Retin then told Ranges to calm down. Calling him a weakling, he used a snake sword technique called Ambush Pierce. His aura took the form of a snake and darted straight at Ranges' chest. While Ranges defended himself from the attack, Retin chuckled and said that all of Ranges' big words were empty. He continued to taunt him, calling him pathetic and a little runt, before launching into another attack. Ranges remained silent, only raising his spear once again to prepare for the coming blow. However, when Retin used another snake strike sword technique called Snake Slash, Ranges was caught off guard. His eyes widened. The attack twisted and turned like a snake, making it impossible to block properly, and he received a painful blow to the side. Blood gushed from his body. Ranges immediately thought that he had been absolutely confident in his defense, but somehow Retin managed to change the direction of the blow right in flight. Retin mockingly asked what was wrong with him and challenged Ranges to try hitting him back, if he was even capable of it. Determined not to lose, Ranges declared that he could still attack and get Retin. He immediately used another cloud and water spear technique called Floating Clouds in Water. But before their weapons could clash, Retin suddenly smiled. The next moment his attack curved again and changed direction, hitting Ranges again and sending him flying back. The ensuing explosion sent Ranges flying into a wall, and it made Lika and the others very worried, while Sieg continued to remain silent, watching the battle carefully. As the dust slowly settled, everyone saw Ranges kneeling on the ground, clinging to his spear. Ranges thought to himself that he was trying his best to parry and counter Retin's attacks, but every move he made was backfiring. Retin asked if Ranges had considered using his own moves to counterattack. Laughing mockingly, he told Ranges not to make fun of him. He called Ranges a poor guy, then revealed that his main specialty was counterattacks. Retin then added that this was a great misfortune for Ranges, as he was several levels above him in everything. Meanwhile, Ranges struggled to stay on his feet, clinging to his spear. He muttered that what Retin was claiming was simply impossible. However, Retin suddenly stepped forward and grabbed Ranges by the hair and said he didn't understand the illusions he was living in. He mockingly declared that the offspring of a pseudo-dragon would never be able to become strong. In his words, Ranges was ultimately a nobody, just another weakling like his father. Even in his most desperate struggle, Ranges told Retin not to dare insult his father. But holding Ranges by the hair, Retin punched him in the face with all his might and called him a fake dragon. Ranges fell to the ground, but Retin continued to kick him again and again and attack him, shouting that a fake dragon like Ranges could never defeat a real one. As Ranges continued to take heavy blows from Retin, he began to realize that he truly was completely hopeless. He thought he'd gotten stronger, but perhaps it was all just a foolish illusion, for he remained weak. Tears slowly streamed down his face as the thought echoed in his mind that he was nothing but a fake dragon after all. At that very moment, a memory surfaced in his mind. It was the time when he and his father were fishing on the riverbank. The father asked Ranges if he liked fishing, and added that he himself really enjoyed this activity. He told Ranges that, as he could see, he loved fishing while watching the clouds pass and the water flow, just as he was doing at that very moment. When Ranges asked if his father liked the clouds and the water, he smiled and replied that the clouds always floated so serenely, and the river's water continued to flow endlessly. Observing them helped him understand that all human worries were actually very small and trivial things. When Ranges asked what he meant, his father only replied softly that perhaps someday Ranges would understand it too. Back in the present, Ranges lay on the ground, covered in blood, whispering words that flowed and trickled. Mintrick remained silent, watching the battle carefully. Shortly after, Retin grabbed Ranges again and declared that this was where their fight would end. As Retin concentrated his aura into his fist for the finishing blow, he muttered that the fake dragon would forever remain a fake. He added that Ranges had to crawl through life on all fours. But when Ranges opened his eyes, he remembered Sieg's words spoken just before the battle began. Like gently flowing water, Ranges' aura began to flow smoothly throughout his entire body. Before Retin's attack could reach its target, Ranges managed to block it. Retin never expected such a sudden defense from Ranges, and sensing the aura emanating from him, he quickly stepped back to pick up his sword. Meanwhile, Mintrick smiled in surprise at this unexpected turn of events. He just saw the third star on Ranges' chest shine brightly. Undeniable proof that Ranges had broken through to the 3-star level right in the midst of his battle with Retin.